In order for Carlo Gambino to rise, something else had to fall. He watched it happen. Watched empires collapse under their own weight, under the heat of publicity, indictments, bullets. Gambino studied it all. From the back rooms of tenement buildings to the docks of Red Hook, he saw where the money flowed and where the power sat. It was at the top, always the top, and from there it trickled down, into City Hall, into police stations, into the pockets of judges, union bosses, customs officials, and every politician who had a price. At the time, organized crime had a grip on the docks so tight that nothing, no bananas from Central America, no Turkish tobacco, no French wine, moved without their say-so. And it wasn't just shakedowns. They turned imports into leverage, a way to control an entire industry. Then the Depression hit. 1929 gutted the economy. Shipping companies went belly up. Labor unions were desperate for cash. That's when the Mafia moved in. They didn't come in with guns. They came in with cash, loans, bailouts, lifelines. And with that money came control. The mob propped up the unions, then used those same unions to squeeze the shipping companies. When those companies collapsed, they bought them outright. Then they transformed them. Cargo ships became cruise lines. Tourists replaced freight. The Mafia wasn't just moving goods. They were moving people. They became international businessmen. By the 1950s, organized crime didn't just run the docks. They ran the industries built around them. If a bridge needed building, if a highway needed laying, if a skyscraper needed pouring, they had a stake in it. They controlled the concrete. They controlled the steel. They controlled the hands that did the work. It was a billion-dollar operation, and it was divided neatly between 5 syndicates. Frank Costello headed what was left of Luciano's old organization. Joe Adonis, Tough Tony Anastasia, and Albert Anastasia now commanded the former Mangano family, taken by force. Tommy Lucchese had inherited the Galliano crew. Joe Profaci ran his own tight-knit crew out of Brooklyn, and Joe Bonanno quietly managed his own interests out of East Harlem and the Bronx. These weren't just Italian bosses, they were industrialists. They had partners, Jewish racketeers, Irish muscle, and a growing influence in Washington. Their influence didn't stop at ports and pavement. They had their hands deep in America's newest addiction, entertainment, gambling, nightclubs, showbiz, and travel. These were industries that looked clean, but weren't. Gambling was booming across the country, and while Gambino had his bookmaking and numbers rackets in New York, the real action, Vegas, Havana, Miami, was in the hands of the heavyweights, Lansky, Adonis, Genovese, Costello, and Anastasia. Anastasia was now a player on that level. He wasn't subtle, and he wasn't patient, but he was in. With the Commission, New York's shadow government, spreading its roots from California to Chicago to the Deep South, they controlled not just crime, but culture. They owned the stage, and they owned the spotlight. And in the background, the intelligence agencies watched and sometimes helped. When American forces marched into Germany in 1945, they didn't just take prisoners, they took brains. Operation Paperclip brought over Nazi scientists, psychologists, propagandists. The US government wanted to understand one thing: how the Nazis got a civilized country to turn on itself, how they sold hatred, how they manipulated minds. The answer was propaganda, and now the US wanted a taste of that same playbook. They needed tools. Hollywood became one. Madison Avenue became another. And organized crime. Sometimes it was a partner. Sometimes it was a problem. Either way, it was never ignored. By the early 50s, the government wanted to clean house, or look like it was trying. Enter Estes Kefauver. He rolled into town with subpoenas, cameras, and an appetite for headlines. The Senate committee hearings were on fire, and Kefauver had one name circled in red ink: Albert Anastasia. the murder-intent butcher who'd muscled out the Mangano brothers and now ran the docks like a feudal lord. If Kiefover wanted to understand the waterfront, he needed Anastasia. If he wanted to get to Lansky's gambling empire, stretching from Cuba to Vegas, he needed men like Adonis, Genovese, Costello, and Mike Miranda to start talking. He was building a map of corruption, one witness at a time. What he didn't know was that he was laying out the exact infrastructure that Carlo Gambino would inherit. Every empire had an expiration date. Anastasia was unstable, dangerous, unpredictable. His presence in Cuba, already under Lansky and Santo Traficante's control, rattled the foundation. The Bahamas, Latin America, the offshore casino circuit, they were delicate, high-stakes businesses, and Anastasia was the wrong man in the wrong place. When he was taken off the board in 1957, everything shifted. That year would define Gambino, because that year he didn't just survive, he stepped in, quietly, methodically, and took over. But before we can understand how Gambino built his empire, we need to know what he inherited. That means we need to look closely at the men who built the rackets, gambling, shipping, unions, tourism, construction, and how they ran it all like Fortune 500 CEOs with guns. And that brings us to Meyer Lansky. He wasn't just an accountant. He was the architect, the man behind the curtain. And for Gambino, Lansky wasn't just a partner, he was a model. To understand Gambino, we need to look at Lansky and Luciano to then understand the empire Gambino would soon call his own. By 1950, Luciano had been in exile for 3 years, trapped in Naples, suffocating under sunshine and surveillance. The American government had deported him, but they hadn't forgotten him. They watched him like a hawk, chased ghosts through customs reports, sat on his phones. But things were changing. The US was tightening the screws on Italy, insisting military aid came before food. The Italians, proud and starving, started pushing back. That's when something strange happened. "I didn't ask for it," Luciano recalled. "Didn't pay for it either. One day a guy from across the street at the Caserna comes over and says, 'Would you like your passport back?' I said, 'Sure, you bet.' Just like that, they handed it to me. It was a political game, and he knew it. The Italians was trying to stick the needle into Uncle Sam, he said, for telling them the American loans would have to go for military defense, and never mind the food. Shit. At that point, the Italian people just wanted to eat. With a passport in hand, Luciano started moving again. Europe opened like a map. Switzerland came first, Zurich. Lansky had opened an account there on his honeymoon, and Luciano wanted to check it. Maybe a couple 100,000, but I wanted to make sure nobody was fooling around with that nest egg. Then came Paris, Longchamp's racetrack, shows. He went alone, unnoticed. "I'd never been to Paris before," Luciano said later. "Only stayed 2 days, but it took me 2 months to tell Igea every little detail." First thing she asked was, "Did you go to the ballet?" I bust out laughing. She starts crying and doesn't talk to me for a day. And then there was London. Cold, grey, alive. After living in Italy, I missed everything about New York, even the weather. The cold in London, it was just like back home. I'd stand on a street corner, letting the wind blow across my face. Freezing and loving every second of it. He stayed at the White House Hotel. "Can you imagine lucky Luciano sleeping at the White House?" he said. "I even thought about sending picture postcards to all the guys back home." But the shadow followed him. Narcotics were everywhere now. The old bootlegging routes had turned into heroin highways. The government needed a face for the new war on drugs, and they wanted Luciano. It didn't matter that he had warned them years earlier not to touch dope. "I told them in '46, he said. "The racket's worth billions, yeah, but it ain't worth what it costs." Still, They tagged him with a new name, the King of Junk. Charles Siragusa showed up in Naples like a man with something to prove. He posed as a buyer, tried to bait locals. But Luciano's reputation in Naples was sharp. Word got back to him fast. "I wasn't in Naples 2 days before I heard about it," he said. "Then I hear he's trying to get guys to plant packages on me. That was too much. So I sent word to the Questura. They picked him up and threw him in the clink." Siragusa sat in jail all night, afraid to break cover, but terrified not to. Eventually he cracked. The Naples cops didn't buy it. It took a week of wires before anyone believed who he was. After that, Siragusa had it in for him. "He hated me more than Asslinger," Luciano said. And that was saying something. Giannini came next, a courier, an errand boy for Lucchese, but he was a fink. He shows up from Rome, says he's got messages, offers me a deal, black market money. I tell him I'll think about it, but something didn't sit right. Soon after, Giannini got caught pushing penicillin. That hit differently. "They didn't give a shit about black market money," Luciano said, "but gouge a guy's eyes out for penicillin. That got them sore." In jail, Giannini screamed for Siragusa. That confirmed it. So I sent word to New York. This guy's a fink. In September 1952, Giannini was shot in the head in East Harlem. Meanwhile, Siragusa wasn't done. He raided Luciano's house, tore apart shipments, followed him with cameras. Igea suffered most. They searched the place and I told her this life wasn't for her. She didn't say a word, just grabbed me, held on tight. That's when I stopped talking. Luciano even tried going straight. Candy exports, electronics, farmland. Siragusa blocked everything. "They said we were smuggling junk in the candy boxes," he said. "We wasn't. But they tested everything. By the time the lab results came back, the candy was ruined. I dropped 40 grand. He made promises to Igea, but it had to look right. If it looked like she talked me out of the rackets, I'd be finished. In this country, which makes you a castrato. She understood. So I kept the front, even if I wasn't Charlie Lucky anymore. He opened a shop in Naples, American toasters, mixers, fridges. It worked for a while. Then the big players undercut him. He lost $50,000, again. Then came Don Cheech, the priest with a dream. He said, "Here, my friend, you see the clinic of Our Lady of Lourdes." Luciano got involved. I got more satisfaction from that than anything I ever did. Igea teased him. Make protection for a few millionaires, then play Robin Hood and raise money for the clinic. Back in America, his blueprints made men rich, Gambino, Genovese, Anastasia. And here he was, broke, still handing out bills to deportees, still pretending to be the boss. But underneath the suit, he was just a man getting older. By 1955, Luciano took another hit. A new travel ban locked him in. Rome, Naples, and Sicily. That was it. Police Chief Sandro Siragusa made sure it was public. Luciano, enemy of the state. The press had their headlines before he even sat down. It wasn't a trial, it was an ambush. Senator Charles Tobey said Luciano was using US sailors for gambling, dope, women. Then came Police Chief Florita, called him a drug trafficker, a national danger, a threat to American security. This time, it stuck. After the hearing, socially dangerous. The sentence? House arrest every night. No travel beyond 60 miles. For me, it was like a nightmare, Luciano said. Their investigations didn't make a dent in the States, except making my life miserable. Siragusa kept the pressure on. By 54, it reached a head, an election in New York. Democrats accused Dewey of cutting a deal with Luciano. Dewey pushed back, said he released him for war work. It got so messy, the Italians staged a hearing in Palermo. Luciano played along. "You would have thought I was General Eisenhower," he said. "I was so good on that witness stand I could have won an Academy Award." But he knew the truth didn't matter. He stayed silent, not out of loyalty, but strategy. He needed friends. He got them. Suddenly, elites warmed up to him, publicly and privately. War hero, misunderstood exile, a man trying to go straight. Meanwhile, the real war, the media war, was in full swing. In America, the Kefauver hearings dominated TV, gritty, unfiltered. Organized crime had a cast. Anastasia, Lansky, Costello, Zwilman, Hill, Marcello. Even Mayor O'Dwyer got dragged in. Dewey refused to testify. The man who deported Luciano acted like he'd never heard of him. Luciano watched from Naples. "The spotlight was on," he said. "And I knew I wasn't ever going back." Even Costello cracked. Wouldn't show his face, just his hands, twitching on live TV. It infuriated Luciano. Americans couldn't get enough. Ratings soared. The hearings made organized crime real. One after another, the mob pled the fifth. Even Hoover had to act. He blamed the system, politicians, cops, judges on the take. By 55, Luciano came to terms with it. America was gone. "I was already out of all the rackets, trying to live up to my word, to Igea." But that didn't stop them. His legacy, once built on control, now unraveled. The empire was in other hands: Costello, Lansky, Adonis, Torrio, Mike Miranda, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Profaci and Vincent Allo. Luciano had trusted the wrong people too long. So he gave in to Igea's advice. They moved to Via Tasso. High on a hill, quiet, private. It was the beginning of his surrender. He opened a second business in the Hotel Royal, X-ray machines, ECG monitors, for Father Scarpato's clinic. But the police still watched. It didn't matter. He still found ways to sneak off, to meet Scalice, Red Levine, whoever flew in from New York. Sometimes he escaped to Sicily, to Cinque Vitality's villa. That was his haven. And in a few years, he'd know there was no going back. You can't spend your whole life trying to walk back through a door that's already closed. In 2 years, he'd go to war with Genovese. Scalise would be killed. Gambino would stop waiting. But for now, Luciano was slowly done fighting. He was just a man in exile, still rich, still watched, but no longer in charge. When Frank Costello's face landed on the cover of Time magazine in 1949, it wasn't just a publicity hit, it was a warning shot. Costello was supposed to be the invisible boss, the politician in a fedora. Now he was public property, and that meant trouble for everyone orbiting him, including Joe Adonis. The spotlight on Costello lit up the entire Luciano network, because by then it wasn't just one family. It was a web: Costello, Adonis, Anastasia, Mangano, Gambino, tied by decades of blood, money and silence. Joe Adonis had positioned himself as a bridge, loyal to Luciano, helping Anastasia control the Mangano family, backing Gambino and tough Tony Anastasio on the docks. But the writing was on the wall. The press was circling. The feds were closing in. Deportation was coming. So Adonis began selling off assets, handing parts of his empire to Gambino, quietly, in pieces. Not everything. He still wanted a cut. But Gambino had cash and vision. Joe had headlines and subpoenas. Then came the knock. December 2nd, 1950. Estes Kefauver's Senate Crime Committee wanted a word. He was under bond in both New York and New Jersey for gambling. It didn't matter. The committee was clear. Joe Adonis was going to testify. His lawyer, Harold Corbin, played jurisdiction games, arguing the charges didn't even constitute a crime in New York County. Assistant D. A Vincent O'Connor wasn't having it. Gambling syndicates were interstate. States had to step up or step aside. Adonis wasn't going in alone. His co-defendants, Longano, Lynch, Moretti, Guarini, were all on $20,000 bond. Mob pedigree, same hook. 2 days later, it was official. Adonis was being called to Washington. Public hearing, cameras, microphones. The committee wanted names, numbers, connections. Northern New Jersey was now ground zero. Adonis was the keystone. Not everyone approved. Bergen County's Deputy Attorney General Nelson Stamler blasted the hearings. If I want to question a man, I bring him to my office. He had the files, the witnesses, the gambling dens. But the feds had the script, and Adonis was going to read it on live TV. By December 9th, Judge Leiden approved Adonis and company to attend the hearings. Bail bonds were secured. Still, Stamler protested, "Why go there when the backyard has all the evidence?" Trenton tried to gag him, but Governor Driscoll killed the order. Adonis, meanwhile, played the angles, but the board was shrinking. Gambino stood in the shadows, waiting. On December 12, 1950, Adonis walked into the lion's den and did what every mob boss, with a lawyer and a future, does. He pled the fifth. Dressed like a banker, calm and clipped, every question met the same reply. I respectfully declined to answer. Names, income, business, Stonewall. Committee counsel Rudolph Halley, Senator Toby, and Kefauver all took swings. Nothing. Moretti had gone before him and done the same, claimed he earned $84,000 last year, but lost the records. Said he wasn't avoiding subpoenas, just took a little trip. He admitted knowing Costello, Luciano, Erickson, but denied any business. Claimed he'd never heard of the Mafia or Unione Siciliana. Adonis kept pace. Asked about the automotive conveying company, a Ford-linked transport firm. He clammed up, even with evidence of ownership. Where was he born? Passaic, 1901. Where did he grow up? Brooklyn. Why New Jersey? I like the climate better. Halley smirked. Cooler over there? We're 900 feet above sea level. Adonis deadpanned. Asked about gambling houses in multiple states, legitimate income, or a 1937 paper listing payouts totaling over $200,000 with Frank C. on it. He said nothing. But behind the silence was calculation. The fifth was his shield. He knew federal agents were in the gallery, FBI, IRS, Treasury. Any crack would be used against him later. Kefauver called it what it was: defiance. But the hearings were never about discovery. They were about pressure, about breaking the image. 2 more witnesses, Rutkin and Katina, missed their appearances. Rutkin had ulcers, Katina a heart condition. Kefauver wasn't buying it. On December 13th, the committee recessed, but Adonis stayed under subpoena. Contempt charges were coming, 1 year in prison, $1,000 per unanswered question. Multiply that by dozens. But that wasn't the fatal mistake. December 12th, 1950, the day Joe Adonis sealed his fate. On record, under oath, he said, "I was born in America." It was a lie, a simple one, but it was enough. The government went to work. School records, nothing. Childhood friends, nothing. Birth certificates, nothing. Then, something. He was born in Italy. Adonis had gambled on a lie and lost. He dodged bullets and subpoenas since the 20s. But this was different. Post-Kefauver, post-Costello's bullet, post-Anastasia's looming war. The old guard was finished. The public wanted blood. The government was done tolerating them. Every time they looked at Costello, they saw Adonis. Pull Anastasia's files, Adonis's name was there too. They weren't just connected, they were entangled. 3 names, 3 kings, 3 deportation orders. By 1955, one of them was gone. Joe Adonis. Carlo Gambino was the ghost in the machine. While others lit cigars with $100 bills and made headlines, Gambino stayed quiet. A modest house, a modest wife, an empire built in silence. No clubs, no women, no press, just blood and business. He trusted only his brothers and cousins, Gambinos and Castellanos, a tight circle. No flash, no noise. To strangers, he was just a quiet Sicilian with good shoes. While others burned money in casinos, Gambino stacked his. He spent like a peasant and saved like a banker. Trouble? He already had lawyers on retainer. Joe Adonis was the opposite. Flash over form, expensive suits, track losses, bottles, broads, headlines. He treated money like it grew on trees and thought the law couldn't touch him. But the game had changed. Luciano was exiled. Anastasia under fire. The Bonanos, Lucchese, Profaci, all on the radar. Only the silent ones stood a chance. Not Adonis. The K4 hearings turned the spotlight directly on him. It bruised him and broke him. He didn't have the bankroll or political cover to ride it out. Gambino was richer, quieter, and far more dangerous. By 1951, Adonis had run out of luck. For decades, he was the untouchable. Handsome, polished, always 2 steps ahead. But when K4 came knocking, it all cracked. Now it was prison, deportation, or a bullet. In June 1951, he stood in court one last time, pleaded no contest, hoping for leniency. Instead, 2 to 3 years in prison, $15,000 fine, 5 years probation. Not a death sentence, but his first real time behind bars. The mask cracked. The cameras caught it all. From 1926 to 1951, Adonis had been arrested countless times, but never locked up. Now, for the first time, he couldn't walk away. The Hague machine that once protected him was gone. Eriksson was already serving time. Costello had been dragged into hearings. Now it was Joe's turn. Adonis tried to pass himself off as a salesman, but the mansion in Fort Lee, the wardrobe, the lifestyle, it didn't add up. He was 49, still striking, a face like George Raft, if Raft had played a mobster who won. He started under Frankie Yale, took over the crew after Yale was gunned down, opened Joe's Italian kitchen in Brooklyn, speakeasy, extortion parlor, gambling den. That was his rise. From there, Luciano, Costello, Genovese, Anastasia. He didn't just follow the syndicate, he helped build it. Where the old-school bosses used muscle, Adonis used modernity, streamlined, corporate, strategic. He even tried politics. Backed LaGuardia in 1933. Bad bet. LaGuardia couldn't be bought. When he won re-election, Adonis lost every political connection he had. Licenses pulled. Raids followed. He was told, "Get out of New York." So he did. New Jersey was open, and Frank Hague's men looked the other way. By the early 40s, Adonis was a powerhouse. Gambling clubs statewide, interests in Havana, Miami, even Hollywood. Virginia Hill, courier, syndicate liaison, was briefly tied to him. Then Siegel, then both. Hill wasn't carrying love letters. She was moving intel, drugs, money, orders. The triangle was about power, not romance. Adonis never really pulled out. The World Telegram called his retirement wishful thinking in 1949. They were right. He was too deep. Now he was exposed. The mob had a problem. Adonis behind bars, vulnerable. Joe Adonis, who dodged every bullet without firing one, was finally out of time. Senator Estes Kiefover's crime committee stormed into Miami to expose the syndicate's grip on South Florida. Americans were losing up to $22 billion a year to organized crime, more than the military budget. Gambling was the tap, and the syndicate thrived here. Subpoenas went out. Some names vanished, others stayed quiet. Walter Morris, former grand jury foreman, admitted criminals operated in plain sight. Sheriff Jimmy Sullivan. Out fishing. Judge Stanley Millage described high-tech bookie stations busted at Surfside Hotel. One arrest, no trial. Law enforcement was too compromised. Officers sabotaged citizen raids. You've got people in office who want to enforce the law, Millage said, and others who don't. Daniel Sullivan, ex-Florida Racing Commission official, mapped the gambling wire from Baltimore to Miami. Central hubs included the Dade County news dealers and the farm in Broward, which funneled betting lines across the state. By 1950, over 120 betting spots operated in Miami. Even after race wires were banned in 1949, operations went underground. Key syndicate centers included Colonial Inn, run by Meyer Lansky, Jake Lansky, Joe Adonis, Vincent Jimmy Blue Eyes, Allo, Frank Erickson, and Detroit's Joe Massey and William Lefty Clark. Club Greenacres, same ownership. Bischoff ran dice games. Massey funded him. Island Club, Sunny Isles. Friedlander, Sam Cohen, Game Boy Mannheim, and Cleveland Detroit partners. Frank Erickson operated from Miami hotels like the Wofford and Roney Plaza, using cabanas for layoff betting. He held silent stakes in multiple clubs and laundered bets through racetrack mutual machines. The Wofford Hotel, leased by frontmen, became a syndicate hub. Notables visited: Little Augie Carfano, Charles Fischetti, Angelo, Jip. DeCarlo, Trigger, Mike Coppola, Frank Costello, and Lansky himself. Joe Massey, tied to multiple Miami properties and businesses, co-owned the Miami Provision Co. and invested in restaurants. His longtime partner Lefty Clark lived nearby and controlled Club Greenacres. Detroit's crew, Licavoli, Bomarito, Lieberman, McHugh, Bernstein, were all active. Chicago's Tony Accardo and brother Martin had homes in the area. Louis Ricciardi, with serious priors, also lived in Harding Avenue. The S&G syndicate dominated Miami Beach. Operators included Jules Levitt, Sam Cohen, Charles Friedman, and Harry Russell, ex-Capone man. After the 1949 wire shutdown, Russell rewired the network in 10 days. S&G ran Club 86, Sunny Isles Casino, and Island Club. They netted up to $40 million yearly, with half the profits staying local. The rest flowed north, to New York, Jersey, and Chicago. The Martinique Hotel, allegedly owned by Kid Can Blumenfeld, was a front for the Berman brothers. Julius Kramer, a.k.a. Jules Beeman, ran the gambling floor. The Little Syndicate, Sammy Clark and Harris Levinson, controlled other clubs like Boheme and Greenacres. Syndicate-connected real estate and rezoning plays covered Miami Beach from 43rd to 62nd Street. Wire surveillance expanded via illegal switchboards, piggybacking hotel music systems run by Benny Kay's Lyric Wired Music Co. Bookkeepers and attorneys shielded the paper trails. New Florida laws banned donations from track owners and shut down race wires, but the syndicate adapted with underground networks. By 1950, Meyer Lansky had evolved from mobster to the mob's banker. His financial empire spanned from Miami to Havana and the Waldorf. Every major family, Genovese, Lucchese, Gambino, trusted him. He wasn't muscle, he was money. He moved hundreds of millions across Swiss banks and casinos. When Lansky pitched a deal, the commission didn't vote. It invested. Gambino, quiet and calculating, trusted Lansky deeply, an alliance that would prove fateful. As Kefauver's hearings spread and Cuba opened up, Lansky shifted south. He expanded in Havana and across the Caribbean with backing from Gambino, Lucchese, and others. He built casinos, hotels, and banking fronts. But in 1959, Castro took Havana, and Lansky's empire collapsed. Hundreds of millions were lost overnight. He should have been finished. Joe Adonis, who helped Lansky dominate Miami gambling, had already been deported. He once served as a bridge between New York and South Florida rackets. His absence created a vacuum. With Lansky wounded and Adonis gone, the question became, who would take over? Carlo Gambino stepped in. He and Russell Bufalino backed Lansky financially, not out of loyalty, but strategy. They needed a reliable banker to stabilize the transition. Lansky stepped back, focused on Las Vegas, legitimacy, real estate, corporations. He was no longer king, but still essential. Gambino, operating in the shadows, expanded his influence silently. Unlike Luciano, Costello, or Genovese, who faced exile, prison, or assassination, Gambino avoided headlines. While others fell, he consolidated. As the old guard crumbled, Gambino inherited the empire Lansky and Adonis had helped build. He absorbed Miami's remnants into a quieter, more profitable operation, insulated from law enforcement. He stayed out of view, but fully in control, an underworld CEO rising as the flashy generation fell. Albert Anastasia didn't rise through the ranks. He exploded through them. The man came out of death row with a kill list in one hand and a union charter in the other. In the 1930s, when prohibition gave way to shipping and the Mafia needed muscle on the docks, Anastasia wasn't just useful. He was essential. He was the executioner, the mad dog they needed to scare the unions into line. But to understand how he got there, you have to go back to the beginning, to the bones of southern Italy. Anastasia was born on September 26, 1902, born in Tropea, Italy. Carlo Gambino, same year, different month. August, born in Palermo. Two boys, two futures, shaped by the same catastrophe, the 1908 Messina earthquake. At 5:20 a.m., the deadliest natural disaster in European history ripped through the Strait of Messina, leveling entire towns. Waves 40 feet high crashed onto Sicily and Calabria. Over 80,000 dead. Survivors either buried the past or fled it. A generation of orphans, refugees, and hardened men was forged in that chaos, and two of them would go on to reshape the American underworld. Anastasia made his way to Brooklyn and got to work fast. He claimed a piece of the waterfront, but it was already spoken for. The story goes, he beat the rival to death with his bare hands. That earned him his first prison sentence and his first reputation. In the lockup, he caught the attention of a mob contact who reached out to a rising star named Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano had a problem and needed a solution. Anastasia was the solution. Luciano pulled strings, greased judges, lined up top-shelf attorneys. 4 witnesses from Anastasia's first trial ended up dead. By 1922, Albert walked out of prison a free man. The state had no case. The message was loud and clear. This guy's protected. From that day forward, his loyalty to Luciano was unshakable. He didn't care who his official boss was, Mangano, Masseria, or Maranzano. His heart beat for Charlie Lucky. Luciano wasn't yet the kingpin he'd become, but he was getting there. The early 1920s were chaos. Prohibition had turned cities into battlegrounds. Irish, Jewish, and Italian mobs carved up territories, while the bootleg market poured out more cash than anyone had ever seen. The docks were everything. Liquor came in by ship, by crate, by barrel. Control the piers, control the pipeline. That's where Anastasia thrived. He went right back to the Brooklyn waterfront, where the Irish and Italians were fighting a silent war over control. Luciano backed him, and soon Anastasia and his brothers locked down a stretch of piers that ran for 5 miles. Everything moved through them. Liquor, meat, cigarettes, sugar, and every nickel spent near the piers kicked back up the chain. You wanted to shine shoes, sell candy, open a bar, you paid. If you didn't, you disappeared. He wasn't doing it alone. Around this time, Anastasia connected with a mid-level mobster named Louis Capone, no relation to Al. Louis ran a restaurant in Brooklyn and mentored young killers, particularly the Italian and Jewish factions, who would form Murder, Inc. Guys like Abe Reyes, Harry Strauss, and Frank Abandando. Capone gave them food, advice, and contracts. Anastasia gave them leadership. By the late 1920s, he had climbed to the top of the International Longshoremen's Association. 6 locals under his control. The docks and their politics belonged to him. He still wasn't a boss, but he didn't need to be. He was feared. And when war broke out between Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, the Castellamarese War, Anastasia picked a side, Luciano's. This was the bloodiest chapter in New York mob history. Old world bosses clung to the Sicilian code, refusing to work with outsiders. Luciano, Lansky, Costello, Siegel, they had other ideas. They wanted an American mafia, multicultural, modern, and business first. The old men stood in their way, so Luciano made his move, with Anastasia's help. When it came time to take out Masseria in 1931, Anastasia was one of the men trusted to make it happen. Later that year, when Luciano turned around and eliminated Maranzano, he used the same strategy: speed, precision, no second chances. Anastasia was in that loop too. Luciano wiped the board clean and created the commission. 5 families, equal power, no more senseless wars. Anastasia was rewarded. He was made underboss to Vincent Mangano in the newly formed Mangano crime family, what would later become the Gambino family. But here's the thing: Anastasia didn't respect Mangano. He didn't answer to him. His real loyalty stayed with Luciano. Loyalty. That was everything to Albert Anastasia, and everything Luciano needed. It was tested, again and again. And each time, Anastasia chose blood over brotherhood. Chose lucky. But the choices cost him. Dutch Schultz was more than a partner. He was a friend. Dutch feared Anastasia the same way a man fears a loaded gun. But he admired him too. They came up under the same banner, Murder, Inc., a fraternity of killers who took contracts coast to coast, no questions asked. When Dutch wanted Tom Dewey dead, he didn't go shopping. He went to Anastasia. It wasn't about money. It was one friend asking another to pull the trigger. But Anastasia couldn't move without checking in with Luciano. He did. Luciano said no. Dewey was hands-off. The heat was too high. Anastasia held the line, but Dutch kept pushing. So, Anastasia did what he was told. He kept an eye on Dewey. Word is, he trailed him through Manhattan dressed as a woman, pushing a baby carriage, just to watch him up close. When Luciano found out, he went ballistic. He called a sit-down with the commission. Dutch had become a problem. His war chest was empty, his case was burning through his bankroll, and his people were panicking. If Dutch beat the charges, he'd come out swinging. If he lost, they'd divide his empire up like war spoils. But nobody wanted to wait. Luciano made the call. Anastasia's crew got the job. Mendy Weiss, Charlie the Bug Workman. They cornered Dutch in a Newark chop house and left him bleeding out in the bathroom, still clutching his napkin. Anastasia didn't pull the trigger himself, but make no mistake, it was his hit. Something broke in him. He never said it out loud, but he told Luciano in private. You're going to regret this. You're going to regret killing Dutch and not killing Dewey. Anastasia meant it. He wanted Dewey dead. But Luciano was thinking long game. He was done with the street stuff. Wanted to rub shoulders with elites, win over judges, be the mob boss the establishment could respect. Anastasia couldn't understand it. He loved Lucky, but he didn't always get him. And when Dewey turned around and prosecuted Luciano on a prostitution beef, sent him away, Anastasia swallowed it. But the taste stayed with him. It changed him. He started making moves on his own. Quiet moves, bold moves. Moves Luciano wouldn't have approved of. Then it happened again. Lepke Buchalter, another close friend. Murder, income, royalty. Anastasia's Jewish brother-in-arms. They ran rackets together, broke bread together, buried bodies together. But Lepke got greedy. He iced out the Italians in the garment district. That crossed the line. The commission called for blood. Lepke had betrayed the syndicate. Luciano gave the green light. Anastasia didn't fight it. But it tore him up inside. He knew what Lepke had done. But he also knew what they'd been through together. So Anastasia did what no other mobster ever did. He helped deliver his best friend to J. Edgar Hoover. Lepke became the first gangster in U.S. history sentenced to the electric chair. The night they strapped him in, Anastasia didn't sleep. He told himself it was for lucky. Everything he did was for lucky. Then came Normandy. When the Allies stormed the beaches in 1944, Anastasia paid off a personal debt the only way he knew how: in blood. He helped the U.S. Navy keep the docks clean, kicked the Nazis off the piers in his own way. It was his contribution to the war effort, his way of making it up to Luciano. Now locked up, then deported, first from the States, then from Cuba. Through all of it, the betrayals, the hits, the heartbreak, Anastasia stayed loyal. But inside he was unraveling. He was always close, always quiet, always brutal. But trusting a lunatic meant betting that his past wouldn't come back to haunt him. And in Anastasia's case, it always did. By the 1940s, the name Murder, Inc. was fading from headlines. Abe Relis had taken his swan dive out the window of the Half Moon Hotel in 1941, conveniently right before he was supposed to testify against Anastasia. The public forgot. The cops moved on. But in the underworld, nothing stays buried. Then Jack the Dandy Parisi reappeared. Parisi was a ghost from the Murder, Inc. days, a natty dresser, bad manners, and worse timing. In April of 1950, he beat a Brooklyn murder rap from 1939. The trial was 4 days of legal theatre, capped by Judge Louis Goldstein furiously dismissing the case due to lack of evidence. But before he let Parisi go, the judge said it plain. It appears you were responsible for the killing of many individuals and were the trigger man for Murder Incorporated, headed by Lepke and Albert Anastasia. Parisi, who once shot the wrong man, a music publisher named Irving Penn, just shrugged and let out a belch in court. The law couldn't touch him. Witnesses recanted. Evidence vanished. Anastasia knew what this meant. The old ghosts were walking again. And when the past comes back, it brings subpoenas. That same year, the papers, Daily News, Time, the Daily Telegraph, all started printing Anastasia's name again. Over and over. The old stories were resurfacing. Reles, Lepke, the docks, the bodies. And Anastasia, already paranoid, started spiraling. When he feared someone might talk, he didn't ask questions. He killed them. Then he killed the guys who helped with the killing. It was a cycle, one dead witness at a time. And it all pointed back to the Longshoremen's Union, where Anastasia had built his empire. He wasn't just the boss of the docks. He was the boss of what came into New York, New Jersey, and a half-dozen other ports stretching up and down the coast. He owned the International Longshoremen's Association from the inside out. If a shipment hit the East Coast, it passed through his hands, or it didn't move at all. But 1950 was a different kind of war. Anastasia wasn't fighting street crews or rival bosses. He was fighting Washington. Kefauver and the Senate Crime Investigating Committee were in motion. The hearings were coming, and the closer they got, the more erratic Anastasia became. That year, District Attorney Miles McDonald of Brooklyn made it clear. The Waterfront was wired into something bigger, a national syndicate. "They have to be," McDonald said. "If they weren't, the big mobs would knock them off." Judge Samuel Leibowitz put it sharper. "This is an empire of crime." The Brooklyn scandal was blowing up. Cops were retiring under fire. The papers were screaming about $20 million gambling syndicates. Names were flying: Harry Gross, Mickey Cohen, Joe Adonis. But when it came to real power on the East Coast, two names stood tallest: Adonis and Anastasia. Then came the story nobody could spin, the one about William O'Dwyer, the ex-mayor of New York. He had once been the DA, the man who could have, maybe should have, taken Anastasia down. But he didn't. In 1945, a grand jury accused him of incompetence and negligence for failing to prosecute Anastasia for murder. The case was described as the perfect murder, but nothing ever came of it. And when O'Dwyer left the mayor's office and got handed the diplomatic post as U.S. ambassador to Mexico, everyone knew why. He was skipping town before the heat got too hot. Senator Estes Kefauver didn't miss a beat. He was already working with McDonald, planning hearings, tracking down connections between Brooklyn bookies and the Chicago outfit, Kansas City mob bosses, even the West Coast's Mickey Cohen. They found Mickey's phone number in the pockets of half the players in the country, including Charles Benaggio, who was shot dead in Kansas City just weeks earlier. McDonald didn't mince words. "At least one gambling syndicate in Brooklyn is controlled by a group headed by Joe Adonis and Albert Anastasia," he said. Adonis had already vanished. The feds couldn't find him. Anastasia stayed put, but everyone knew it. The noose was tightening. By mid-1950, Albert Anastasia wasn't just a man with a past. He was a man surrounded by ghosts, by headlines, and by witnesses who couldn't seem to stay alive long enough to testify. He had built an empire with a gun, but now the guns were out of his hands, and the subpoenas were coming. And the thing about subpoenas, they don't get scared easily. By the fall of 1950, Albert Anastasia's name wasn't just back in circulation. It was the drumbeat behind a series of headlines shaking the foundations of New York. What started as whispers inside the Brooklyn DA's office had become a full-scale political earthquake. The Brooklyn grand jury was working overtime, digging into the Harry Gross gambling syndicate, a $20 million a year machine backed by dirty cops and protected by silence. But every tunnel they dug kept leading to the waterfront, and at the center of that empire was Anastasia. District Attorney Miles McDonald played it tight, but the streets were buzzing. 6 more cops and known bookies were pulled in for questioning, but the real heat was circling around men like James Reardon, a former plainclothesman left sitting uncalled in the hallway. Behind the scenes, there were persistent reports, and everyone knew what that meant, that Albert Anastasia himself might be called in. McDonald didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. Simultaneously, Kings County Judge Samuel Leibowitz, a man with a memory like a knife, began digging through the files from 1945, back when William O'Dwyer was Brooklyn's district attorney and Albert Anastasia was the ghost no one wanted to chase. Leibowitz didn't forget. The Peter Pan murder case was still hanging over the waterfront like a fog that wouldn't lift. A union activist garroted and buried in quicklime, believed to be Murder Inc.'s work. Anastasia was the obvious suspect. The press had called it the perfect murder, and O'Dwyer had done nothing. Now O'Dwyer was sitting pretty in Mexico as the U.S. ambassador. But his escape was falling apart. The DA's office wasn't just following gambling money anymore. It was pulling at every thread tied to the docks, the unions, and the flow of global trade. Manhattan DA Frank Hogan was running a parallel probe in Chelsea, where a new mob was coming up fast. Guys cut from the same cloth as John Dunn, the waterfront enforcer executed just the year before. Dunn's gang had run the piers below 14th Street like a private army until the state stepped in with a lethal injection. Now Hogan's men were sniffing around again. There was talk of a rising ex-con, name withheld, whose path to power was starting to look a lot like Dunn's. Anastasia didn't like competition, but this time he couldn't control the story. Back in Brooklyn, MacDonald was already predicting the next phase, the waterfront rackets. He wasn't subtle. They're definitely connected, he told reporters. They have to be. If they weren't, the big mobs would knock them off. Judge Leibowitz backed him up. It's an empire of crime, he said flatly. The Brooklyn mobs are unquestionably connected to higher echelons in the underworld. Still, they insisted this wasn't like Kansas City or Chicago. Not political, just corrupt. But that distinction was paper-thin and shrinking. The press began to circle back to O'Dwyer. He had once called the Brooklyn investigation a witch hunt, but now, from his brother's ranch in El Centro, California, he was changing his tune. Said he wanted all the facts out. Said he wanted the cops cleaned up. But the ghosts of 1945 kept knocking. And then there was Harry Gross. His little black book held Mickey Cohen's private number, a call to LA muscle from the East Coast Syndicate. That number also turned up in the pockets of Charles Benaggio, the Kansas City political boss who got his head blown off in April, along with his triggerman, Charles Gargotta. They were finding bodies and phone numbers from Missouri to Manhattan, and the trail kept pointing back to Anastasia and Adonis. Adonis had vanished. No one could find him. The Senate Crime Committee was chasing shadows. But Anastasia? He stayed put, half defiant, half delusional, as if the past couldn't touch him. MacDonald wasn't buying it. At least one gambling syndicate in Brooklyn is controlled by a group headed by Joe Adonis and Albert Anastasia, he said. The same Anastasia who had once ruled Murder, Inc., who had never been prosecuted for the Panto killing, and who was now being named, again, in open investigations stretching from the Brooklyn docks to the Senate floor. By October, it wasn't just a grand jury anymore. It was political warfare. Governor Thomas Dewey, smelling blood, opened his re-election campaign with both barrels. This is government by bookmakers and gangsters. Dewey accused O'Dwyer of running out. New York City now has the greatest scandal in its history, he said. And the NYPD? It was crumbling. Commissioner Thomas F. Murphy, fresh off the Alger Hiss case, was swinging the axe. Cops were retiring overnight. Some refused to testify. Immunity pleas started stacking up like dead fish on the docks. All the while, the press kept circling back to one name, Albert Anastasia. The grand jury had once called him the most notorious killer in Brooklyn. O'Dwyer had called the Panto case the perfect murder. No one ever proved it. No one ever tried. But in 1950, it was all coming back, and Anastasia was slowly running out of time. By the end of 1950, Albert Anastasia had traded blood on the Brooklyn docks for Spanish stucco in Fort Lee. To the genteel residents of the Palisades section, lawyers, bankers, old money, he was just the mystery man behind the locked gate and shuttered windows at 75 Bluff Road. But to anyone who'd been reading the Daily News, he was something else. A 5-time murder suspect, with a house built on stolen steel and silent payoffs. The place was a fortress, a $100,000 Miami-style villa with red tiles and high wire, tucked just far enough away from Manhattan to feel invisible, until reporters showed up. They called it the house that Jack built. But everyone knew Jack was Anastasia. The story broke in November, and it hit like a shot across the bow. The labor, the supplies, and even the light fixtures had been skimmed from a government-contracted ship repair business called Sancor Corporation, a front, stuffed with fake executives and bankrupted as soon as the big house was done. The government never saw it coming. Officially, Sancor was run by Benedict Macri, a clean-cut frontman with no rap sheet and just enough nerve to sign the papers. In reality, Anastasia was the money and the muscle. He saw a racket in the booming ship repair trade during the war and figured if the government were handing out contracts, he'd be the one collecting. The only problem? His record made him radioactive, so Macri, his longtime buddy, put his name on the checks. Anastasia stayed in the shadows. Then it all collapsed. Sancor folded in 1947. The bankruptcy filing showed $232,000 in assets, $717,000 in liabilities, and more than 390 workers unpaid. The company owed the government $500,000. The Maritime Administration claimed the firm had done $5 million in sloppy, negligent repair work. So bad, one official said it caused as much damage to our ships as it made repairs. Behind the numbers was theft, tools, materials, payroll. Workers told the Daily News they were sent to Bluff Road while still on Sancor's books, told to fix the boss's place. One guy was pulled aside by Macri and told, "This is your big chance." His real job? Work on Anastasia's mansion, while Uncle Sam picked up the tab. It wasn't just fraud, it was arrogance. The neighbors didn't know who he was. Not really. They saw the Doberman behind the 6-foot gate, the spotlights, the priest stopping by on occasion. Some deliveries were marked for Anastasia, others for his wife under her maiden name, Elsa Bagnesi. The Fort Lee police chief didn't think he lived there, but Jersey's deputy attorney general, Nelson Stamler, knew. And so did the IRS. The reporters showed up after a tip from a local attorney who tried to kill the story, said the man didn't want attention, said it would impair his social standing. The joke, of course, was that Anastasia had no social standing to damage. His only real neighbor was Joe Adonis, just 5 blocks away at 1020 Dearborn Road, under the name Doto. Anastasia answered the phone himself. He was polite. Said he'd do an interview. Told the reporter to make it easy for yourself, pal. They set the time. But the next day, he no-showed. His lawyer said the meeting was off. Said it wouldn't be discreet for a man of Anastasia's past accomplishments to answer questions. The phrase was almost comical. This wasn't just a guy with a record. This was a man who'd escaped a death sentence after 3 witnesses turned up dead. Who'd been arrested for murder 6 times. Who helped build Murder Inc. and ran the Brooklyn docks like his personal fiefdom. The king of the waterfront had buried more bodies than questions. And now, in the quiet suburbs of New Jersey, he wanted privacy. But the walls were closing in. The federal government was sniffing around the Sancor bankruptcy. The Daily News had already tied Anastasia to the collapse. And with the Senate Crime Investigating Committee circling the docks, the spotlight was only going to get hotter. Fort Lee might have seemed like a quiet place to disappear. But for Albert Anastasia, it was just another stage. By November 1950, the headlines weren't just catching up to Albert Anastasia. They were crawling up his driveway in Fort Lee. The $100,000 stucco fortress on Bluff Road had blown his cover. Now every law enforcement agency with a badge and a subpoena wanted a piece of the story. U.S. Attorney Frank J. Parker announced it plain. His office was opening an immediate investigation into the Sancor Corporation, the bankrupt wartime ship repair business Anastasia had quietly controlled through a paper front. The scam was simple. Sancor got millions in contracts from the U.S. Maritime Commission during the war. Benedict Macri, Anastasia's longtime pal and current murder suspect, signed the checks. Anastasia stayed off the books, but Sancor didn't build ships. It built his house. Labor and materials were siphoned straight from the docks in Brooklyn and North Bergen into the Palisades of New Jersey. And when the company went belly up, it left behind $500,000 owed to the government, 390 unpaid workers, and one mob boss in a brand new home. Parker wanted it all: the books, the bankruptcy papers, and the men who worked the yards. He said his agents would be looking particularly at entries indicating theft of government property, labor misdirection, and criminal conspiracy. In short, he was aiming straight at Anastasia's front door. In Fort Lee, New Jersey's Deputy Attorney General Nelson F. Stamler wasn't far behind. He already had Anastasia's file on his desk. Fat with police records from Elizabeth, including a little-remembered 1946 labor war at the Phelps Dodge plant, where one man ended up dead and several others in the hospital. Anastasia and his brother Tony had been enforcers in the strike-breaking operation. "Several strikes over here have been settled very suddenly," Stamler said dryly. "It bears some looking into." The federal heat was matching the state pressure. Anastasia had made a career off avoiding fingerprints, always the guy behind the guy. But now it wasn't just local cops asking questions. It was Parker's criminal division. It was the Treasury. It was the Kefauver Committee. This wasn't a street beef. This was a federal siege. Back in Brooklyn, the Eagle and the Daily News started printing his resume in bold. They called him what everyone in the racket already knew: Lord High Executioner of Murder, Inc. The guy who signed off on hits like a CEO rubber-stamping memos. The guy who only made moves after his enemies were in the ground. Now, for the first time, the government was officially in his business. And it had teeth. The feds remembered everything. They remembered Abe Relis going out the window at the Half Moon Hotel before he could finish testifying against Anastasia. They remembered the union man, Morris Diamond, and the prosecution that died on O'Dwyer's watch, despite, as court documents later revealed, the DA's office having competent legal evidence for a first-degree murder case. They remembered that the grand jury in 1945 had branded Anastasia a killer and said O'Dwyer looked the other way. But now the politics were different. O'Dwyer was in Mexico, Dewey was running for re-election, and Anastasia wasn't a quiet name in a footnote anymore. He was front page. Meanwhile, in Bergen County, the gamblers were sweating. Mike Todd, the flashy Broadway producer, had filed for bankruptcy. In his debt column, a $30,000 line to Jack Lemmon, a Cliffside Park bookie fronting Frank Erickson. Lemmon had already been convicted thanks to former Newark judge Jimmy Pilecchia, who dropped $130,000 in bad horse bets. Pilecchia was now doing 10 years for bank fraud. Lemmon got 3 for bookmaking. Deputy A.G. Stamler said it straight. New York's underworld had migrated across the river. Since LaGuardia cracked down in '44, 70 to 80 known racketeers had quietly planted themselves in Bergen County. Anastasia was just the most dangerous of the bunch, and his proximity to Joe Adonis, just 5 blocks away, didn't go unnoticed. The Bergen County grand jury was getting ready. A new special panel was set to be drawn in January 1951. And in the background, federal investigators were sharpening their focus. Anastasia wasn't just the silent partner in a dead company anymore. He was the target of a criminal conspiracy case with a $500,000 price tag and a trail of bodies that hadn't gone cold, just quiet. They were asking the right questions now. Who really ran Sancor? Where did the money go? Who stole the labor? And why had no one ever touched Anastasia before? The myth of invincibility was cracking, and Albert Anastasia, who once walked invisible across the murder files of New York, was about to have his day in the light. Meanwhile, Anthony Anastasia, Albert's brother, tried to paint himself as a peacemaker during a violent waterfront strike in New Jersey. Senator Kefauver, arching an eyebrow, asked if he was playing Good Samaritan. "No," Anthony growled. And in that one word, he revealed more truth than in all his testimony. As the hearings pushed deeper, the noose tightened around the necks of the empire builders. The committee exposed a network of bookmaking payoffs, police protection, and dockside shakedowns stretching from Manhattan to Hoboken. In one chilling moment, testimony revealed that strikebreakers hired by Phelps Dodge Company had gunned down a picket during a labor dispute, and no one had ever been prosecuted. Frank Costello, even as he played coy on the stand, admitted he had made Tammany Hall bosses keep promises to nominate judges of his choosing. He listed his close friends among election officials and Democratic power brokers, casually describing a system where politics and organized crime were merely two sides of the same coin. If there was a face to the horror of Murder Incorporated, it was Albert Anastasia. And now, under the pitiless spotlight of the Senate Crime Investigating Committee, the so-called Lord High Executioner of Gangland stood exposed. Anastasia, heavy-set, graying, his dark eyes as cold and pitiless as a winter storm, had been waiting a week for his turn to testify. He had lounged in the wings while others crumbled, sneered, or pleaded under the television lights. Now it was his turn. There was a savage irony in it. The man once entrusted with delivering death sentences for Brooklyn's underworld sat, unscathed, in his $65,000 mansion on the cliffs of Fort Lee, New Jersey, overlooking the Hudson River, beyond the reach of prosecutors. Those who might have testified against him had been silenced, murdered, vanished, or claimed by mysterious accidents. Anastasia had built a fortress of corpses around himself, and now he was nearly untouchable. Years earlier, when the streets of Brooklyn ran slick with blood, it was Anastasia who handed down the verdicts. According to William O'Dwyer, then Brooklyn's district attorney, Anastasia presided over a secret court, a kangaroo tribunal of killers and thugs, where guilt was a foregone conclusion, and the penalty was always death. Murder and Incorporated was no myth. It was a national assassination bureau, operating with cold precision under the silent sanction of bosses like Joe Adonis, Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky, and Charlie Lucky Luciano. The men of Murder Incorporated did not just kill gangsters who crossed the line. They killed citizens, businessmen, witnesses, anyone who got in the way. And Anastasia was the general of their armies. The committee circled back again and again to the mysterious death of Abe Kid Twist Reles, the most important witness ever turned against Murder Incorporated. In 1941, Reles, a career assassin turned informant, had been kept under 24-hour guard by 6 New York City policemen at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island. He was preparing to testify against Anastasia in the slaying of longshoreman Peter Panto, a killing meant to crush a rebellion against gangster control of the waterfront. But on a cold November morning, Reles fell to his death from the 6th-floor window. The bedsheets tied together in a pathetic rope told one story. The 6 police guards, allegedly asleep, told another. Senator Charles Tobey, blunt as a hammer, put it plainly. Reles had not fallen. He had been pushed, and the death had served only one master, Albert Anastasia. As Anastasia appeared before the committee, wearing smoked glasses and claiming conjunctivitis, he tried to project the image of a wounded, misunderstood man. "I have sore eyes," he protested. "I have been here 4 days. I am a sick man." But the Senate investigators showed him no pity. There would be no excuses for the Lord High Executioner. Even his brother, Anthony Anastasia, had taken the stand days earlier, admitting that he and all the Anastasia brothers had entered America illegally by jumping ship. Now, with deportation proceedings hanging like a sword over their heads, the walls around the Anastasias began to tremble. Still, Albert Anastasia smiled. All the key witnesses were dead. All the crimes were buried deep. He was the last survivor of an era drenched in blood, and he knew it. Back on the stand, William O'Dwyer fought to defend his record. He was calm and composed at first. Natalie, dressed in a blue pencil-striped suit and a blue and white tie. But as the lights bore down on him, as the questions hammered harder, sweat gathered on his brow. Senator Toby tore into him over the conflicting accounts of Reles's death. O'Dwyer's testimony did not match that of his former subordinate, Frank Bowles. The senator accused him of soft-peddling the truth, of sidestepping the rot that had hollowed out the police department, the courts, and the waterfront. O'Dwyer tried to steer the conversation back to slum conditions, to petty crimes, to pinball machines and gambling dens that corrupted children. But Senator Estes Kefauver cut him off sharply. The committee did not come here to hear about mint machines or urban decay. They had come to tear the mask off organized crime. And at the heart of it all, haunting every testimony, every accusation, was the silent, smiling spectre of Albert Anastasia. By March of 1951, the American public, exhausted by whispers of corruption and scandal, had been glued to their television screens, eyes wide as the Senate Crime Investigating Committee, under Senator Estes Kefauver, dragged the underworld into the light. The hearings had promised fire and fury. They had promised justice. They delivered spectacle. Across New York, Detroit, Los Angeles, Miami, and St. Louis, the committee had peeled back a corner of the festering underworld blanket that smothered the nation's political machines. But for all the drama, the laughter, the tears, and the moments of raw confrontation that unfolded before the cameras, the committee carefully avoided digging into the deepest, most dangerous roots. They exposed the runners, the middlemen, the liaison brokers. They paraded figures like Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and Albert Anastasia. But the true puppet masters, the Wall Street bankers, shipping magnates, steel barons, and political kingmakers, remained untouched, unnamed, unseen. Who pulled the strings behind Murder Incorporated? Who protected Anastasia, Costello, Adonis? Who held the leash when gangsters rigged the waterfront, terrorized the auto plants, and flooded the nation's cities with blood and narcotics? The answer, as many suspected but few dared say aloud, led straight into the boardrooms of big business and the halls of high government. On the surface, the Kefauver Committee looked fearless. They forced Ambassador William O'Dwyer to admit he visited Costello during World War II, supposedly in his role as a United States Air Corps general, to warn about black market operations involving hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen army supplies. They hauled in Joe Adonis. They grilled Costello until the racketeer croaked answers through his ravaged throat. They even dared mention Tammany Hall's long, cozy dance with the underworld. But they stopped short. They did not subpoena Joe Ryan, the kingpin of the AFL's International Longshoremen's Association, whose reign of terror controlled the eastern waterfront and whose political ties shielded gangsters and killers. They did not call the shipping firms, the loading companies, the industrialists who trafficked with gangland to make a fortune during the war. They did not mention that Henry Ford III's operations had once intertwined with Adonis, whose control of the new car carrier associations moved Ford's vehicles out of Edgewater, New Jersey. They did not touch the billionaires, the real empire of crime, where Wall Street, politics, and organized racketeering merged, remained safely hidden behind the theatrical grimaces of men like Costello and Adonis. The committee refused to probe Governor Thomas Dewey's administration in Albany, even though the trail of corruption led straight to his doorstep. They balked when Dewey invited them to Albany, a transparent ploy to keep the spotlight out of his capital. They ignored the fact that Dewey held William O'Dwyer politically hostage because O'Dwyer knew too much about the Pete Panto murder. Pete Panto, the courageous dock worker, had dared to defy Joe Ryan's gangster-controlled union in 1939. He had rallied the rank and file against the waterfront's bloody rule. For his bravery, he was lured to his death, his body cemented, hidden in the marshes of Lyndhurst, New Jersey. O'Dwyer, as Brooklyn District Attorney, had once declared he knew exactly who had killed Panto. Albert Anastasia. But no indictment ever came, because behind Anastasia stood the shipping companies, the freight operators, the waterfront owners, powerful men who preferred Panto dead and the unions docile. Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, went on living in luxury in Fort Lee, New Jersey, not far from where Panto's body was discovered, untouched by prosecutors on either side of the Hudson. While O'Dwyer and Dewey danced around Murder Incorporated, New Jersey officials were busy pursuing a different kind of justice, executing 6 innocent black men in the infamous Trenton 6 case. The irony was as thick as the blood drying in the gutters of Red Hook and Canarsie. While gangsters like Anastasia ran free, black workers were framed, brutalized, and sent to their deaths without mercy. The Kefauver Committee never mentioned the Trenton 6. It never spoke of the whitewashing done by men like Miles McDonald, the Brooklyn district attorney who had exposed a $20 million gambling ring but remained silent about police brutality against Puerto Rican and black youth. It never questioned whether the same mobsters running illegal bookmaking were also the ones orchestrating the terror against union organizers and minorities in working-class neighborhoods. In Union County, New Jersey, the truth finally slipped loose. Prosecutor Nathan Cohn admitted that during the Phelps-Dodge strike, management hindered investigations into the Murder Incorporated thugs who had killed Mario Russo, a union organizer. He named Captain David Winkman of the Elizabeth Police Department, a man who had whitewashed Anastasia during the original grand jury hearing, as the obstacle who helped the gangsters walk free. Winkleman later helped arrest New Jersey Communist Party leaders for distributing peace leaflets, proving once again that law enforcement bent the knee not to justice, but to power. In February 1951, even as the Kefauver hearings played out on live television, union leaders from the Phelps-Dodge strike were still being dragged into courtrooms on fabricated charges, while the killers and their backers moved on to bigger, bloodier ventures. It was a spectacle, a circus of controlled outrage. The committee let the cameras roll, feeding the American people the tragic theater of crumbling gangsters and tearful politicians, while the true criminals, the ship owners, the auto magnates, the steel kings, the political bosses, remained securely behind their gilded walls. William O'Dwyer had washed his hands of the Panto case and been rewarded with a cushy ambassadorship to Mexico. Albert Anastasia lived like a king in Fort Lee. Frank Costello still whispered into the ears of Tammany Hall's kings. And the real machinery of crime, the machinery that mingled with Wall Street portfolios and presidential campaigns, ground on, untouched, and unstoppable. As March 1951 closed, and the Kefauver Committee prepared to submit its final report to the United States Senate, the question lingered in the smoky air of America's courtrooms and living rooms alike. Would they tell the truth? Or would the blood and betrayal be swept back under the rug, hidden once more by the same hands that had made it all possible? The audience, millions strong, leaned closer to their black and white television screens, waiting, hoping, knowing. There were wheels within wheels, and they were still turning. As March 1951 bled into its final days, a new storm broke across New York. One that reached back almost a decade, to a window high above Coney Island. The death of Abe Reles, the government's star witness against Murder Incorporated, had always smelled rotten. Now, 9 years after Reles's body shattered on the sidewalk outside the Half Moon Hotel, the case was stirring once more. New information, uncovered out of town by investigators working for First Assistant District Attorney Edward Silver, hinted at truths long buried. 40 witnesses were being called back into the fold. Even William O'Dwyer, now safely installed as the United States ambassador to Mexico, was being drawn back toward the fire. Summoned before a Brooklyn grand jury probing gambling, police graft, and the silent rot infecting the city's core. Reles had been the key, Reles had been the storyteller, the canary perched on a bloody perch. When he fell, or was pushed, from that fifth-story window in November of 1941, the case against the underworld's darkest lords plummeted with him. It was Senator Charles Tobey who said it loudest, and with the least fear, when he declared on a live radio broadcast that Reles had been murdered, silenced by the very lawmen paid to guard him. And as the days ticked down toward the end of March, the old suspicions gained new breath. Investigators were hunting old ghosts. They were ready to question Reles's widow, now remarried. They were looking for Anthony Maffiatore, the Murder Incorporated chauffeur who had vanished into the fog, perhaps taken for one last ride to ensure his silence. And while Brooklyn turned over its dead stones, across the river in Brooklyn Heights, Joseph Anastasio, brother of the feared Albert Anastasia, was seized by immigration authorities. His crime? The same as his brother's, slipping into America by jumping ship, decades earlier. The web was tightening, but it was tightening too late for justice. When Albert Anastasia finally appeared before the Senate Crime Investigating Committee, he wore the look of a man confident the world could never touch him. His voice was calm, almost bemused, as he claimed innocence. "I never hurt a hair on a fly's head," Anastasia declared. It was a farce. William O'Dwyer, the former Brooklyn district attorney, now far from the muck in Mexico, had laid it all bare before the committee. Anastasia, he said, was the executive director of Murder Incorporated, the Lord High Executioner who carried out death orders issued by the highest councils of gangland. The combination, the National Crime Syndicate O'Dwyer described, was a vast, sprawling machine of blood and silence. It was directed by an invisible board of mob bosses: Lucky Luciano, exiled but powerful; Meyer Lansky, quiet architect of the syndicate's financial empire; Benny, Bugsy; Siegel, the West Coast kingpin; Joe Adonis, the East Coast's political manipulator; Willie Longy Zwillman of New Jersey; and Frank Costello, the so-called Prime Minister of the underworld. At their feet, Murder Incorporated the troops. Reles had told O'Dwyer everything during their first meetings, all the gruesome mechanics of gangland justice, how kangaroo courts were held in darkened back rooms, where hoodlums were tried by their peers, and where there was but one sentence ever handed down: death. Reles had warned bitterly, "You'll never get anywhere with this. I'm warning you. You'll never get anywhere." He knew too much. He trusted no one. He expected to be killed. And so, he was. His body found broken beneath a hotel window, supposedly guarded by 6 hand-picked New York policemen. O'Dwyer told the committee that he had built a perfect case against Anastasia for the murder of Moish Diamond, a labor leader who had stood in the wrong man's way. The plan had been to prove that Jack Parisi, a Murder Incorporated hitman, had executed Diamond under Anastasia's direct orders. The web was drawn tight, but Reles's death snuffed out the final light. The perfect case collapsed. No charges were brought. No verdict was reached. Instead, Anastasia, who had once sat on death row in Sing Sing, whose multiple murder charges had all mysteriously fallen apart, moved into a palatial mansion in Fort Lee, New Jersey, overlooking the Hudson River like a dark king surveying his domain. O'Dwyer painted a chilling portrait of the true power behind America's cities, a nation divided and parceled out by the combination. Each mobster assigned his turf, his rackets, his dominion. Each rewarded not in cash, but with the spoils of vice: pinball machines, prostitution territories, waterfront control. Anastasia commanded the New York docks with an iron hand. Moretti and Zwillman ruled New Jersey. Siegel and Lansky carved up the West Coast, and all of them answered to an invisible authority, one that combined the raw force of gangsters with the quiet control of politicians, bankers, and industrialists. If one of their number betrayed the code, even whispered a forbidden truth, The combination would convene a court, and the troops would be sent to mete out the only sentence they knew. There was no appeal, no forgiveness, only death. While the Kiefover Committee shined Klieg lights onto the hunched forms of men like Costello and Anastasia, the real machinery of corruption spun on, untouched. Brooklyn District Attorney Miles McDonald, who postured as a bookie buster, had himself turned a blind eye to the brutality of New York's police, whose clubs and bullets had spilled the blood of Puerto Rican and black youths across neighborhoods from Canarsie to Red Hook. And across the river in Elizabeth, New Jersey, it was revealed that even in the Phelps Dodge strikes, where murder incorporated, gunmen broke Union lines with bullets. Men like Captain David Winkleman of the Elizabeth Police Department had been more interested in framing innocent labor leaders than prosecuting gangland killers. The American people saw the costumed villains, the gamblers, the enforcers, the thugs. But behind them, invisible, grinning, stood the true kings of crime, the shipping magnates, the auto executives, the steel monopolists, the men who pulled the strings and counted the bodies as collateral damage. By the end of March, as the Kiefover Committee prepared to file its official report, millions of Americans clung to the hope that justice would be served. But behind the Senate chamber doors, the verdict was already written. Relis's body still lay buried beneath the weight of unanswered questions. Anastasia still lived in luxury. Costello still whispered into the ears of political power. And the combination, that silent empire of blood and wealth, still ruled from the shadows, wheels within wheels, turning unseen, grinding down anyone foolish enough to believe that truth alone. When the 1950s opened, America had a real shot at cleaning house. Senator Estes Kiefover rolled into Washington like a crusader, looking to crack the spine of organized crime. But what he didn't realize was this: the mob wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. It had evolved. It had gone legit, or at least it knew how to wear the mask. Corruption had become institutional. It wasn't just gangsters paying off judges anymore. It was judges becoming part of the machine. Senators, DAs, governors. When you yourself are dirty, you don't promote clean. You surround yourself with the next you. People who'll protect your secrets, preserve your legacy, and keep the money flowing. It's not just about bribes. It's about succession. That was the real danger Kiefover was up against. He thought he was chasing bookies and muscle. He was really up against a new American aristocracy, one built not on birthright but blackmail, wire rooms, and the threat of exposure. The rot had already reached the top. Franklin D. Roosevelt had taken his swing, hitting banks, trusts, and corporations. He almost cracked the backbone of the elites. But when he died in office, the door opened. Truman walked in and said it himself. "I just got the job because the other guy died." He never thought he could beat Tom Dewey, and neither did organized crime. They were stunned when Truman won. But they weren't worried for long. Truman was a Pendergast man, born from the Kansas City corruption machine. With him in the White House, the mob finally had their man in the Oval Office. After that came Eisenhower and Nixon. But Nixon wasn't just a political climber. He was a product, built up by the Mafia and CIA, an agency born from men who worked with mobsters and corporate warlords. Guys like Sam Zamuri, king of United Fruit, a man who played Central America like a chessboard. Carlos Marcello and the New Orleans outfit were right there too, pushing power through back channels. The Dulles brothers, John Foster and Allen, weren't just diplomats. They were fixers, corporate agents dressed as statesmen. And when those men needed an army that didn't wear uniforms, they created the CIA. They needed control. Abroad, at home, wherever the money was. Kiefover didn't understand what he was stepping into. The mob was shedding its skin, adapting. If gambling got too hot in New York, they shifted to Vegas. If the unions caught heat, they went offshore. They moved money through Swiss banks and pressurized newspapers through ad dollars. They bought elections the way corner boys buy sandwiches. The syndicate had outgrown street-level crime. Now they were playing foreign policy. Still, Kefauver swung. He dragged the most powerful names in organized crime in front of America's cameras. Joe Adonis Dotto, called in December 1950, pleaded the Fifth so many times it sounded like a broken record. Frank Costello refused to show his face, walked out mid-testimony and got slapped with contempt. Meyer Lansky sat cool next to him like the chess player he was. Others came too. Virginia Hill, Bugsy Siegel's old flame, sat under oath, pulled threads that led to Chicago and Havana. Willie Moretti and his brother Salvatore, fresh from New Jersey. Albert Anastasia, stone-faced, seething. Anthony Anastasia, his dock boss brother. Gerardo Catena, Jersey strong-arm. Frank Erickson, the gambling czar. Michael Lascari, lesser known, but wired in. Joe Profaci, the Brooklyn boss with ties that ran back to Sicily. Tommy Lucchese, cool, calculated, and impossible to corner. Kefauver couldn't nail them all, but he bloodied a few. Some, like Adonis, went away for short stints. I refused to talk and lost time. But the hearings uncovered something else. Citizenship fraud. Most of these guys had lied on their paperwork. That became a new weapon. Deportation. If you didn't have cash in hand or the right judge in your pocket, you were cooked. Costello still had enough clout to duck the hammer, but Adonis, not so lucky. The net closed around him, and then the bodies started dropping. Tommy Galliano, dead, February 1951. Vincent and Philip Mangano, murdered. Willie Moretti, shot in the head, October 1951. Waxy Gordon, dropped dead of a heart attack in 52. With the Mangano brothers out of the way, Anastasia took control of the family. But the family was bleeding. His partner in chaos, Joe Adonis, was next to go. Facing deportation, Adonis started selling everything off, especially the shady stuff. He didn't want anything left behind that could be used against him. And the men he trusted most, Anastasia and Gambino, were the ones he sold to. But Anastasia, he was a wild card, erratic, prone to violence, dangerous even to friends. Gambino, on the other hand, was ice cold, already a millionaire, quiet, discreet, trusted by everyone, from Tough Tony Anastasia, Russell Bufalino, Stefano Magadino, Santo Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, Paul Rica, Sam Giancana, and Tony Accardo, Joe Zerilli to Tommy Lucchese. He didn't just inherit Adonis's assets, he absorbed them, took care of Adonis's family, looked out for Luciano's people, kept everything above board, at least on paper. Adonis's brother Bartolo went legit, garment district ties, union contracts, real business, and always under Gambino's wing. No side deals, no kickbacks, just the illusion of clean hands. Because that's how it worked now. The new Mafia wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, it was institutional, it was bureaucratic. It wore suits, signed contracts, and bought senators. And behind it all, watching it tighten, was Anastasia, still brutal, still loyal, but more unpredictable than ever. In 1925, Lucky Luciano sat across from one of his closest allies. Not Costello, not Adonis, Frank Scalice. To Charlie, Scalice wasn't just a trusted friend. He was a tactician, a recruiter, a scout. He had an ear to the street and a Rolodex that spanned every major crew in America, from Palermo to the Bronx, New Orleans to Chicago. Frank had a gift. He could look at a young guy hustling on the curb and tell you if he was muscle, button material, or boss in waiting. That year, Scalice introduced Luciano to a quiet, watchful kid out of Palermo. Small guy, sharp dresser, spoke little. But Lucky remembered that meeting for the rest of his life. He said in the 1960s, "The first time I laid eyes on him, I knew he'd run it all one day." The kid's name was Carlo Gambino. Scalice understood power. He understood structure. Luciano had big plans for him. He even envisioned Frank as the rightful boss of the Mangano family, long before Vincent Mangano got the nod. Unlike Johnny Torrio, who Luciano respected but resented for his ties to prostitution rackets, Frank kept clean. He was old-school Sicilian, Palermo-born, disciplined, sharp. And he could work with anyone, Italians, Jews, Irish. He was tight with Capone, Trafficante Senior, Paul Ricca, Tony Accardo, Stefano Magaddino, and the Canadian crews. He knew everyone from Jake Guzik to Meyer Lansky to Longy Zwillman. Before Willie Moretti died, Scalice had his respect too. Even in the most fractured days of the American underworld, there was one man Luciano trusted to handle the worst: Frank Scalice. He was the consigliere you brought in when diplomacy failed. A wartime don hiding behind a calm demeanor. Frank Scalice, born Francesco Scaglione in Palermo, 1893, came to the US in the 1910s with his brothers. He settled in the Bronx, and by the early 1920s he was already a major player. He didn't need to climb the ladder. He was handed a capo slot almost immediately under Salvatore D'Aquila, then the reigning boss of bosses after Morello's fall. Scalice had a clean record by mob standards. One burglary charge in 1920, one vagrant arrest that got tossed. But behind that slim rap sheet was a slippery operator. Police believed he'd been tied to multiple killings over the years, but they could never make anything stick. As the power structure shifted, Masseria on one side, Maranzano rising on the other, Frank played it cool. When D'Aquila got clipped in 1928, Scalice backed Alfred Mineo, D'Aquila's top lieutenant. Then, when Mineo was assassinated in 1930 during the Castellamarese War, Scalice switched sides. He bet on Maranzano, and he bet right. After Maranzano's brief reign ended with a knife in the back, courtesy of Luciano's crew in September 1931, Lucky remade the underworld. No more bosses. Instead, the Commission Board of Directors organized crime. Scalice, ever adaptable, stayed in Luciano's orbit, but not as boss. That job went to Vincent Mangano. Frank didn't vanish. He just went quiet. In the 1930s, he stayed out of the headlines, working behind the curtain. He mentored guys like Agnello della Croce and Anthony Gaggi's father. He maintained strong ties to Luciano in exile and became an essential piece of the machine, keeping tabs on the casinos, the unions, the money trails. In 1945, his name surfaced again. Scalice had been helping Bugsy Siegel set up the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas. Everyone wanted in. Anastasia, Lansky, even Luciano. But Siegel was too loose, too flashy. Delays, money leaks, busted grand openings. It was a mob investor's nightmare. When Bugsy took one bullet to the head and one through the eye in 1947, it wasn't clear who ordered it. But after Siegel was gone, Frank's name started appearing on more Vegas ledgers. When Mangano vanished in 1951, his brother's body found in a ditch, Vincent never seen again. It wasn't hard to read the message. Anastasia had finally made his move. He was boss now, and he needed someone steady beside him. He picked Frank Scalice. Frank wasn't flashy, he didn't make noise, but he was connected, trusted, and dangerous in his own quiet way. He was also suspected in the disappearance of Vincent and Benedetto Macri in 1954, two brothers who crossed the wrong people. Law enforcement never got him, but everyone knew. Frank was also Luciano's man to the end. He kept Lucky informed on casino cuts, on Joe Adonis's quiet moves, on what Gambino and Vito Genovese were planning. Scalice was the last firewall, the last wartime don in the middle of a city about to explode. And for Gambino or Vito to rise, he had to go. A wartime strategist, a recruiter, a diplomat, a killer, Luciano's shadow, Gambino's mentor, and perhaps the last man who could have kept the commission from turning into a boardroom bloodbath. But in the mob, even loyalty gets you killed. As the 50s roared on, Joe Adonis knew it was almost over. The subpoenas, the headlines, the smell of heat in the air. America was getting ready to toss him out, the same way it had Luciano. So, he started moving differently. 1 foot in, 1 foot out. He made trips. Quiet, careful trips. Switzerland, Canada, Havana. Not vacations. Reconnaissance. Meyer Lansky always kept Luciano in the loop, more or less. But things were moving fast now. Too fast. Even Meyer couldn't keep pace with it all. These guys were no longer working off the same playbook. Everyone had their own escape plan. And Adonis, he was rewriting his in real time. He liquidated everything. Anything he could cash out got cashed out. The clean stuff he handed to his kids. He figured if he were going to start over in Italy, he'd need a fresh name, clean books, and a bank account nobody could touch. Not the feds, not Gambino, not even Luciano. That's when he called Lansky. Asked about Switzerland, about Zurich. Lansky gave him the map. "It's easy," he said. "You go in, make a deposit, nobody asks questions, nobody pays taxes. You can even loan it back to yourself and keep the interest." It was a perfect game, if you played it right. Luciano, meanwhile, was watching the clock run down in Naples. He had Igea, the love of his life, and a growing emptiness. Power didn't mean much anymore. Respect, yes. Recognition, sure. But the hunger? That was gone. Gambino saw it in his eyes during a visit. Charlie wasn't the same guy who pulled strings in Harlem or ran Havana like a private casino. He was slowing down, letting go. Still, he wasn't blind. He saw what was happening in Zurich and in New York. 2 men who used to be brothers were turning into enemies. And it wasn't over bullets. It was over money. Lansky had mastered the art. The money moved like smoke. Casino skim, shakedowns, rackets. It all flowed out of the States and into Switzerland. Quiet, clean, legal enough to pass, illegal enough to thrive. The playbook was simple. Bag the cash, board a private plane, land in Zurich, walk off the tarmac, straight into a bank lobby. No customs, no questions. Deposit the money, pick up a chocolate bar, fly back home. Sometimes they didn't even unpack. This was the 1950s, when banks and gangsters were learning to speak the same language. From those accounts, Lansky loaned the money back into legitimate businesses. Vegas casinos, hotels, jukebox routes, vending machine empires. He was building the mob's Wall Street. And Luciano? He was watching from the sidelines, trying to claw his way back in. "It was all nice and legit," Luciano recalled years later. "We borrow money from ourselves and pay interest on that dollar right into our own pockets." It was like Lansky always said, "A lot of dough is nice, but it don't do no good just lying around. We gotta work it like the bankers do." Only difference was, our way was better. For Charlie, the Swiss system was hope. He started small, 25,000 here, maybe 30,000. Once in a while, $10,000. Enough to feel like he was still in the game. But something wasn't right. The numbers were off. The cuts too low. The deposits too inconsistent. Someone was skimming, and only a few men had access to those books. Lansky was one. Adonis was another. Then came the call. Joe Adonis was coming to Zurich. Said he had money for Charlie. They'll meet at the airport. No customs, no limos, just walk off the plane and into the bank. Luciano got there early, stood by the arrivals gate watching. And there was Joe, same as always, combing his hair on the runway, like he was stepping onto a movie set. They hadn't seen each other since Havana. It was all smiles, hugs, old times. Joe handed Charlie an envelope. 100 grand, he said. Charlie didn't blink. It was light, but he didn't say anything. Not yet. Then Joe opened his own suitcase. $3 million in cash. Luciano couldn't believe it. 100 grand for the boss and $3 million for himself. He pulled Joe into a private room, shut the door, sat down. Joe, he said, I get 100 grand and you're dropping $3 million? Explain that to me. Adonis didn't flinch. It's mine, Charlie. My own money. Saved it up. Been worried about deportation. Just squirreled it away. Charlie didn't buy it. That's bullshit, he snapped. You live just as high as me. Spend just as much. I get $25,000 a month, plus whatever you skim for me. You guys are minting money and I'm getting crumbs. Joe shrugged. Talk to Meyer. That was it. 30 years, gone in one line. Luciano lit a cigarette and stared at him. This was the guy he brought in. The guy he bankrolled back in Philly. The Scotch deal with Waxy Gordon. The rise through the rackets. All of it. If it weren't for me, Charlie growled, you wouldn't have a fucking quarter. I made you Joe. Joe looked him dead in the eye. Maybe you did, Charlie, but you can't break me. That was the last time Luciano ever trusted him. Back in Naples, Charlie wrote Lansky. Calm, measured, but the message was clear. I want answers. Meyer came, in person, sat down, explained everything. Joe had been saving up, worried he'd get tossed from the States. It was all above board, Meyer claimed. Charlie nodded, said he understood. But he didn't. Not really. Not in his gut. Not in his bones. By 1955, the rot was obvious. The trust was gone. The empire he built was crumbling from exile. Frank Costello was too busy playing statesman to care. The Manganos were dead. Anastasia was a wild card. Lucchese was a boss now, running his own show. Even Gambino was walking a tightrope, trying to keep Anastasia in check without drawing fire. And the money? It kept coming, but less and less, like a faucet slowly shutting off. Luciano was stuck in Naples with Igea, living under surveillance, chains smoking, drinking too much, haunted by Zurich and the sight of Joe Adonis walking off with $3 million. Joe's out there, shaking hands with senators. I'm stuck going to the Snake Pit or the San Francisco, dump clubs with the lights down low so nobody sees the roaches. And this guy's talking about West Point and being a patriot. It burned. Every trip Adonis made to Zurich reminded him he'd been exiled from more than America. He'd been exiled from the future of the thing he built. He couldn't protect it. Couldn't shape it. Couldn't even trust the men who were supposed to have his back. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't come with a bullet or a headline. It came with a suitcase. And a look. And a quiet sentence. Maybe you did, Charlie, but you can't break me. Luciano never forgot it. Never forgave it. And from that point on, the mob's chairman was just another man on the outside looking in. By 1952, the Kiefer hearings had fizzled out without putting a scratch on Albert Anastasia. He walked out of that media storm like he was bulletproof. While others were hiding, he strutted through Brooklyn, Newark and Fort Lee like he owned the sidewalks. Maybe he did. He had a $100,000 mansion overlooking the Palisades, paid for in full back in '49, not far from where Frank Costello held court from the boardroom. Only difference was Costello was shaking hands with mayors. Anastasia. He was still dragging men into alleys. He had killers around him, sure, but more than that, he understood them. That's where the loyalty came from. He didn't just issue orders. He got his hands dirty. Always had. You crossed him. You didn't get a warning. You disappeared. No ceremony, no compromise. The docks, the unions, the nightclubs. He was the sword, not the pen. Then one day something inside him snapped. It was March. Early spring. He was sitting at the table with his morning coffee when he picked up the Daily News. Headline: Brooklyn pants salesman nails Willie Sutton. It was Arnold Schuster, 24 years old, clean-cut, Jewish kid from Brooklyn, selling pants by day, reading FBI Most Wanted posters on the subway at night. He spotted Sutton, America's most wanted bank robber, tailed him to a gas station, flagged a cop. That was it. Sutton was done. The press ran wild with it. Sutton got collared, 3 cops got promotions, Schuster got applause, articles, interviews. He was a hero. Anastasia lost it. He slammed the paper down and said, "I can't stand squealers." To him, that's all Schuster was. It didn't matter that he wasn't a rat, wasn't in the life, it wasn't testifying. He was just a citizen, a pants salesman who did the right thing. But Anastasia didn't see lines anymore, just targets. And Schuster had put a criminal behind bars. That was enough. Then, March 8th, Arnold Schuster was shot dead. Found face down in a Brooklyn lot near a synagogue. 4 bullets in him. 1 in the back of the head, 2 in the eyes, another in the stomach. It was an execution. Up close. Personal. The body was discovered by a local doctor walking home from a Purim celebration. The crowd gathered fast. Floodlights. Cops. Women crying. Neighbors whispering. The Daily News called it what it was: gangland retribution. Anastasia had crossed a line, and no one else dared touch. Organized crime had rules. They bent them, sure. Broke some when necessary. But there was one line that stayed sacred. Don't kill civilians. Not unless they were trying to unionize your rackets. Not unless they were interfering in your business. Not unless they were dirty. Schuster was clean. He wasn't a stoolie. He wasn't trying to take down the mob. He saw something, said something. That was it. Luciano had always warned, killing a civilian brings heat nobody can cool down. But Anastasia didn't care. He had spent years terrorizing the waterfront. Black longshoremen demanding fair pay, beat down. Union men who tried to step out of line, disappeared. He enforced with fear, not finesse. That was his purpose. The mob didn't need him to think. They needed him to act. And he did. Again. And again. For the commission. For Costello. For the big businessmen who didn't want their docks disturbed. But this wasn't orders. This was personal. This was madness. And everyone knew it. By the next morning, it was front-page news across the country. Young hero shot dead. Police vow revenge. Commissioner Monahan put 19,000 NYPD officers on notice. Fined the rats responsible. Rewards flooded in. 12 grand just for a name. Willie Sutton, hearing it from a jail cell, said, "This sinks me." It wasn't a robbery. Schuster still had $83 in his pocket and a watch on his wrist. The cops found threatening letters at his father's store. 11 of them. Crank calls, death threats, warnings, the kind of paranoia that makes a man afraid to leave his house. And when he finally did, he got shot 6 doors from his front door. The feds weren't buying the random act story. They had seen this before. Clean hit, close range, precision. The papers speculated it could have been a crank, a Sutton loyalist, or maybe a mob message. But those inside the life didn't wonder. They knew. Only one man in New York had the stones and the sickness to greenlight a hit like that for no reason other than pride. Albert Anastasia. This wasn't a hit. This was a statement. And it made everyone around him start asking a dangerous question. If he could do that to a nobody, what could he do to one of us? The descent had begun. By 1955, the game was changing, again. And this time, it was personal. Joe Adonis, slick, polished, never a hair out of place, had finally bowed out of the American fight. After years of dodging subpoenas, taxmen, immigration goons, and the long arm of the Kiefer Committee, he did what Luciano once couldn't. He left on his own terms. No rat-infested Turkish freighter for Joe. No midnight shackles. Adonis booked the Conte Biancamano, a luxury liner that docked in Naples with all the style and ceremony of a visiting king. Bridal suite, bed, bath, the works. $740 for the trip. Cash, of course. Luciano watched it unfold from the sidelines. For one of the few times in my life I really zippered my mouth. I knew Joe was coming in. Every day that boat got closer, I kept thinking about the Laura Keane and the Bakir, the stink of sweat and piss and vomit, and here comes this son of a bitch crossing the ocean in perfume and private rooms. I couldn't even leave my house for dinner. The press swarmed the dock, waiting for a reunion. Luciano didn't show, didn't wave, didn't even flinch. "We have nothing in common," he said. Not to the press, but to anyone who asked. The rift between them was public by now. And Adonis, he didn't wait around. He was gone by that afternoon, headed for Milan. A week later, they met. Quiet hotel, out of the tourist zones. No cameras, no champagne. Just two old kings in exile, pretending the kingdom hadn't crumbled. The respect was there, but the warmth was gone. Jealousy. Bitterness. Resentment that cut like razors under polite words. Business only. No sentiment. America was changing, and they both knew it. The old order, Frank, Meyer, Charlie, Joe, was slipping into the history books. Vito Genovese was knocking on the door. Carlo Gambino was already halfway inside. The meeting ended the way it had to. Firm handshakes, no promises, no lies. They wouldn't see each other again until Christmas. That same winter, Charlie got news. The restrictions were lifting. His 2-year sentence from the Naples Commission was over. He could travel again. Nothing major, but a loosening of the leash. He put in his request to return to America. Quietly, like the rest of the deportees, hoping Eisenhower's pen might turn history around. But deep down, he knew the odds. I never expected it. So when it didn't happen, it didn't disappoint me. Igea was happy. She said if I went back, I'd fall right back into trouble. She was probably right. Aslinger made sure Washington had a fat file of lies. Siragusa sent enough paper to sink a ship. The whole thing was theater. Even Charlie knew it. Still, Igea pushed for permanence. She wanted to live in Italy, not just exist. So, Charlie bought the apartment. Top floor. Parco Comola. 25 grand, furnished. A place to finally stop unpacking suitcases. Igea made it beautiful. Embroidered linens, carved cabinets, an L on everything, just in case. She said if we ever split, she'd take the sheets. L for Lissoni or Luciano. Take your pick. Gino, a friend from America, came back to Italy to open a restaurant. Charlie staked him. California opened in '57, right on the Partenope, just down from the Excelsior. It became the place. Soldiers, tourists, gangsters. Everybody came. Luciano and Igea dined there like royalty. The walls were lined with pictures, Sinatra, Costello, the boys. Then, the picture of Sinatra and Luciano disappeared. Some suits came in one day and asked Gino to take it down. Said it might cause problems. Gino didn't argue. The picture vanished, like so many ties to the past. By now, Luciano had his fingers in all kinds of new pies. He helped Father Scarpato with a clinic. Don Cheech talked him into a furniture factory, making school desks for churches. Honest work, for a while. Then came the bills. The problem? You can't sue a church in Italy. Charlie tried. He sent Momo Salemi around to collect. Momo would come back and say, "Charlie, what am I going to do? Hit a priest? Steal from the collection plate?" They laughed. But the money bled out. Another legit business gone sideways. Then came the American visitor, a senator. No name, no cameras, just a handshake in the dark and a request. Can we talk? He drank more liquor, chased more stewardesses, and spent more counterpart funds than 9 congressmen put together, Charlie said. Then he looked at my pinky ring and said, "That's beautiful. I've always wanted one like that." I should have thrown him off the goddamn balcony. But I said, "Senator, you can have it." The day I stepped foot back in New York. Permanent. He never saw the ring again. Or the senator. But the ring. It resurfaced years later. Auction houses, collectors. Another relic of a life that wouldn't die. You want to see real crooks? Look at the US Congress. They steal with a smile. At least we were honest thieves. By 1956, Luciano had eased into a new routine. Bodyguard, driver, Fernando. They raced Alfa Romeos on the autostrada, tuned engines, hit 120 miles an hour just for fun. He bought a racehorse, named it himself, took it to the Agnano racetrack. Back in the States, people would think I fixed the race. Here, nobody gave a damn. That horse never finished in the money, not once. I could walk faster than that nag. He read Shakespeare. Julius Caesar liked the betrayal, understood it. He funded priests, paid for schools, sat down with locals in Sicily. To the people, he wasn't a gangster. He was Charlie. Kids shouted his name. Soldiers came for autographs. If I made it out to their captain, it got them a 3-day pass. At night, he and Igea dined at Transatlantico, Giacomino, Ziteresa. Summers on Capri. Quiet days, careful laughs. He was 56 now. He felt it. And yet, he dreamed. I was only sorry this wasn't all happening in New York. I wanted to come home on the subway with the World Telegram under my arm. I wanted Igea to meet me at the door, kiss me like a regular wife and ask, "What's for dinner?" But New York was gone. That door was locked for good. And in the background, the next act was already taking shape. Gambino, Genovese, Colombo, Bonanno, Buffalino, Trafficante, Giancana. The 60s were coming, and the stage was being rebuilt without him. Frank Costello had survived it all. Wars between families, assassins in back alleys, politicians bought and sold like racehorses. But by 1952, it wasn't bullets chasing him. It was paperwork, legal briefings, congressional subpoenas, contempt charges. The quiet stuff, the kind that sticks. The orders had gone out. Get Frank Costello. His first trial came out of the Kiefover circus, all centered around that now legendary moment when Frank walked out of the hearings without answering a single question about his net worth. On the surface, it looked like defiance. But Dr. Quick, Frank's longtime physician, had an explanation. Years earlier, he'd removed a cancerous growth from Frank's throat. He claimed the walkout was medical, not mob protocol. Frank showed up to court in Manhattan on January 7, 1952, with George Wolfe by his side. Cool, relaxed. The king still had his crown. Jury selection began. Houston A. Hears, a lightning rod, got seated. U.S. Attorney Miles Lane opened quick and cold. George took the floor and turned it into a sermon. He didn't deny Frank's past. He reframed it, said Frank had cooperated fully, aside from one single refusal. Said the committee already tried and convicted him in the press. It wasn't a defense. It was a character witness, aimed straight at 12 average Americans. George believed he was winning. But the judge didn't. In a legal twist, Judge Ryan ruled that Frank had not invoked his Fifth Amendment rights in good faith. The jury was told to only decide whether or not he refused, not why. 11 said guilty. 1 held out. Hung jury. The press had a field day. Frank, walking past cameras, smiled and said, "I've never been unhappy." But inside, the walls were starting to creak. Round 2 started with George sick and bedridden, sidelined by a bad penicillin reaction. Frank brought in Wall Street's finest, Kenneth Spence and his firm. Big names, big money. But in court, Spence made a baffling call. He didn't argue the facts. He argued theory, strategy, semantics. And in a moment that stunned everyone, including the judge, he waved his closing argument. Left the room cold, no fireworks, no fight. Frank lost. 18 months in jail, $5,000 fine. The most severe contempt sentence in New York history. On August 16, 1952, the boss of bosses walked into a holding cell at Foley Square. "I am 61 years old, custom suit, no favors." "Tell the boys I don't want no favors from nobody," he told the marshal. "I'll do my bit. I want to be treated like anybody else." A prison guard showed up with cuffs. "I don't need those," Frank said. "They put them on anyway." He rode to the cell block next to 2 draft dodgers. The irony wasn't lost on him. "You kids are making a mistake. You're ruining your lives." They stared through him. Frank was processed, strip-searched, clothes fumigated, transferred to Lewisburg, then to Atlanta. Then, on October 22, 1952, the final blow landed. The US government filed to strip him of his citizenship. It was insulting after injury. They said he had lied on his immigration forms, used a fake name, and let crooked witnesses vouch for him, including Harry Saucer, the flying hotel man from the hearings. The trap had snapped shut. Frank called George to Atlanta. He had a new idea. Technical, wild, desperate. "File a writ," Frank said. "Atlanta's not a jail. It's a penitentiary. My sentence said, I go to a jail." George stared at him. This was the defense. He filed it anyway. The judge laughed him out of the courtroom. Frank got moved again. To Milan, Michigan. Another cold bed. Another locked gate. The only bright spot? Genovese. The feds filed deportation papers against him too. Same charges. But Veto wasn't behind bars. He was still out, still plotting. Meanwhile, Frank's cases multiplied like cockroaches. There was the tax 5 years of income the IRS said he hadn't paid, totaling $586,000. It started with a $5.10 check written to a plant nursery. The feds tracked it, tied it to a mausoleum. From that, they built a tax evasion case. Grand jury indictments followed, based entirely on hearsay. Bad law, George said. It didn't matter. Frank was out of jail by then, fighting appeals. But the IRS came hard. In the 1954 tax trial, George found himself called a government witness. He'd prepared Frank's taxes, sure, but now he was testifying against him. A legal and ethical nightmare. Frank called in Leo Fennelly to take over, another heavy hitter. George watched from the sidelines as the courtroom turned into theater again. Tradesmen testified that Frank tipped big. A barber at the Waldorf swore Frank paid in 50s. That was their case. Tips. On May 13, 1954, the jury came back. Guilty. Frank stood on the courthouse steps, visibly shaken. For the first time in his life, the cameras captured something rare, a mob boss with no answers. It was a night that would send a shiver through every corner table and back room in New York. Frank Costello was having dinner on West 48th. Albert Anastasia walked in with 2 bodyguards. They scanned the place, locked it down. Anastasia approached Frank, smiled like nothing was wrong, and offered his hand. Frank shook it. That handshake hit the city like a gunshot. They took a booth in the back. Scotch came fast. Anastasia lit a cigarette, leaned in close. "Vito says I'm stepping on his Cuba operation." Frank exhaled a smoke ring, eyes steady. So, Anastasia held his gaze, stone quiet. I don't think talking to Veto would be wise. That was it. No threats, no deals, just a warning. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Costello's world was crumbling inside and out. His health was shot. The feds were closing in. The press was spinning stories faster than he could read them. His name was in every headline, none of them good. And now his syndicate, his empire, was drowning in heroin. He didn't want killers running the streets anymore. He didn't want another Albert Anastasia. But Anastasia was loyal. He respected Frank. Maybe Frank loved him like a brother. It didn't matter. Anastasia was unraveling. He was impulsive, paranoid, and violent. The Mangano's hit had been greenlit by Costello. At the time, it felt strategic. Now, it looked insane. Innocent people were dying for no reason. Bodies were turning up in alleys. Some hits couldn't even be traced back to a motive. Frank was aging fast and knew it. This wasn't his world anymore. Then Anastasia came to him again, about Cuba, about Vito's turf. He wasn't bluffing. He needed money. The IRS was breathing down his neck. He was going to pay what he owed, but that left a hole, a big one, and he needed to fill it. So he started looking at territory controlled by Lansky, Genovese, and Trafficante, especially Havana. That was the line. Costello might have been behind the Havana play, just to keep Anastasia distracted, maybe to buy time. But once Anastasia started stepping on Trafficante's operation, it spiraled. Fast. Maybe Gambino was behind the scenes, whispering in his ear. He told me he had political backing, telling him the bosses would bless it. Maybe none of it was true. Gambino could have moved into Havana, no problem. But Anastasia, too volatile, too loud. Costello wasn't paying attention. He wasn't managing the streets. Murders were happening he couldn't control, and it scared him. He reached out to Luciano for guidance. But Lucky was out of touch. Sitting on his hands in Italy. Useless. Lansky was losing control in Havana. He knew it. Adonis was already on his way out. And Veto was the hungriest man in the room. He had the ambition, the soldiers, and now the support. So, Lansky made a move. Quiet, smart, and final. He aligned with Genovese and Gambino. He already had Lucchese and Profaci in his pocket. That was the new block. Costello was boxed in, and he knew it. Retirement started looking better every day. Take what he could, walk away with his name intact. But he wouldn't give the green light to kill Veto. He wouldn't push Anastasia either. He stalled, delayed. Gambino saw the gap and moved fast. He didn't need Frank's blessing. All it took was a sentence, a look, something that meant only one thing. You're already marked. Back in court, the denaturalization case loomed. His lawyer, George Wolfe, did the digging. Came back with the truth. Frank lied on his citizenship papers. Fake name, concealed arrests. Open and shut. George said to plead. Frank blew up. If you can't beat this rap, I'll find someone who can. So George gave him a name. Ed Williams, a defense pro who specialized in unpopular clients. The judge approved the switch, delayed the trial. By 1956, it hit the Supreme Court. George made a final argument. Hearsay shouldn't be the basis for indictments. The court didn't care. Unanimous conviction. Then reaffirmed the next day. The ACLU stepped in, filed as amicus curiae. Too late. May 15th, 1956. Frank Costello, the so-called Prime Minister of the Underworld, was sent back to prison. But it wasn't over. Ed Williams found a crack in the foundation. Illegal wiretaps. The government had mixed them in with clean evidence. That was a violation. Williams pressed hard. And for the first time in a long time, Frank had a shot. A real one. By the spring of 1957, Albert Anastasia wasn't just in trouble. He was hemorrhaging control. The hits were piling up. Not just on the streets, but in the press, in the Senate, in the whispers around town. And in those last months, something else became clear. Anastasia had started to lose his grip on reality. The public heat wasn't like the old days. It wasn't a street cop on the take or a tabloid smear job. This time, the government was setting the stage for something bigger: legislated extinction. Senators McClellan and Ives were at war over who'd control a $250,000 investigation into labor racketeering. The target: organized crime's infiltration of unions, and the name on top of every page: Albert Anastasia. The Daily News called it Squillante Clams, Faces Charge. It wasn't just another goon taking the fifth. It was the garbage business itself, controlled by Vincent James Squillante, Albert's godson, getting dragged into the daylight. Vincent Squillante was also the man who killed Frank Scalice and his brother Joe. His brother, Nunzio, a Long Island sanitation man, showed up to the closed-door hearing and told the committee nothing except his name and address. Not even a stack of subpoenas would get him to give up his records. But this wasn't omerta. It was panicking. The committee was looking into collusion between carting firms and the Teamsters. And Squillante, Vinny the garbage man, wasn't just a union figure. He was the guy. The gatekeeper of one of New York's filthiest and most lucrative rackets. He had dirt on everyone, including Anastasia. McClellan moved to hold Nunzio in contempt of Congress. But the real story was unfolding off the books. Anyone who touched Anastasia's money, his businesses, or his secrets was suddenly in danger. Not from the law, from him. That mad hat had struck again, one investigator said later. 2 more people dead, innocent. But in Anastasia's mind, everybody was a liability. He was cleaning house, not in strategy, but in fear. That's when Charles and Marie Ferry vanished. April 29, 1955. Miami, Florida. A modest home, a quiet retirement, a bloody nightmare. Charles Ferry was 68, a retired plumber from Fort Lee, New Jersey. His only mistake: he'd done an $8,700 plumbing job for Anastasia at his Jersey mansion and was scheduled to testify in a minor income tax case involving the boss. Just a basic confirmation that Anastasia paid him. Nothing major. But Anastasia didn't care. He saw a witness. And now the Ferris were gone. No bodies, no suspects, just blood. Torn furniture, a ripped curtain, a vanished couple. One day they're sitting on the porch. The next, they're ghosts, Miami detectives said. Authorities floated theories: thrill killers, a family dispute, a botched robbery. But locals knew. You don't just disappear like that unless someone powerful makes it happen. There were whispers Ferry had mob ties in Fort Lee, that he knew things he shouldn't, that he was a big better, that there was a younger woman in the house, that his friend, the former Fort Lee police chief, was found shot in the woods soon after. Ruled a suicide. The only thread that made sense? Anastasia. Anyone who ever worked for him started to look like a threat, and in that lunatic's head, a threat meant a target. Meanwhile, Washington was lighting matches near every fuse Anastasia had. The garment district was under siege. Trucking, shipping, waterfronts, everything tied back to him was being picked apart. 6 grand juries, 4 in New York, 2 federal, all staring into the same abyss. The garment industry, once run from dusty midtown lofts, was now America's bloodiest catwalk. A $6 billion machine powered by 5,000 shops, 250,000 workers, and, buried beneath it all, Murder, Inc. legacy contracts and fear-based economics. The industry was 98% unionized. That should have made it safe. But it wasn't. Not when guys like Johnny Dio acid-blinded journalists. and Albert Anastasia sent messages in blood. The Senate knew it. Javits knew it. So did U.S. Attorney Paul Williams. They weren't just looking for tax cheats. They were tracing corpses. As the Senate dug deeper, a new wave of old-school corruption emerged. Bookies, bribes, truckers doubling as collectors, small-time manufacturers forced to take loans or face ruin. And yet no one talked. One garment worker told the press, "He's the boss and I'm the horse. Wasn't it ever?" Even inside the ILGWU, the resistance was palpable. Locals stalled on organizing drives. Teamster links started to emerge. David Dubinsky, head of the garment union, testified that yes, racketeering existed, but don't expect anyone to cooperate. "They're scared," Javits later said. "And when decent people are scared, the underworld wins." Anastasia wasn't just dangerous now. He was radioactive. He had no allies left. Gambino was setting the table for a takeover. Genovese wanted him gone. Luciano had warned him to slow down. But Albert never took advice, especially not from ghosts in exile. The hits kept coming. The pressure mounted. And when federal investigators finally traced the missing Ferris back to his name, Anastasia knew what came next. He didn't wait. He started eliminating anyone who might testify, anyone who handled his money, anyone who had ever been near a witness stand. He was killing his past. Coming into 1957, Carlo Gambino saw it for what it was, his moment. The empire he'd built stretched across New York and beyond, tied into unions, real estate, Wall Street, racing wires, racetracks, fraud, transportation, gambling, gas, oil, shipping lanes that linked New Orleans, Galveston, Florida, narcotics, which involved Trafficante, Lucchese, Marcello, Genovese, and Corsican traffickers, as well as Sicilian muscle to American ports. He had a hand in the heroin game, quietly moving with the Corsicans in Marseille and the Palermo crew. And deeper still, he was one of the silent cogs inside what was already called Operation Gladio. He knew who in Italy could be trusted with weapons, who could train, who could fight, and where things could be stashed. He had men in New Orleans, connected to the Marcello outfit, ready to ship arms into Europe, and other men trained in the South, their boots laced by U.S. military and mercenaries alike. Florida? That was handled. Gambino had invested in the Trafficante family, pumping money into hotels, gambling joints, and safe houses. He let them run narcotics up through Havana and Tampa, feeding New York's appetite. As Cuba started to splinter, Trafficante always knew one thing. If it came crashing down, Carlo had the resources to bail him out. But Gambino wasn't chasing glory. He was calculating, quiet, old world. He didn't just want power, he wanted structure. He wanted to reshape what had been the Mangano operation, and what Anastasia had turned into his own personal syndicate. Gambino looked out across the chessboard and saw one man playing the same game, Vito Genovese. Genovese was the last man standing after Adonis's deportation and Costello's slow fall from grace. By 1956, Frank Costello was drowning in legal trouble, tied up in contempt charges, tax cases, and Senate heat. Retirement wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. Vito Genovese was the heir apparent, and everybody knew it. He had the memory of an elephant, the nose of a bloodhound, and the fear of every man who ever crossed him. His web stretched into New Orleans, Jersey, Pennsylvania, Florida, Chicago, and Middle America, and he had killers in every state who kissed his ring. Vito's crew was filling up fast. Tommy Eboli, Tony Bender, Philip, Benny Squint, Lombardo, Michel Miranda, Gerardo, Jerry Cattina, Vincent the Chin Gigante, Jimmy Blue Eyes, Russell Bufalino, Joe Bonanno, Joe Profaci. The names came with weight and blood. Gambino was stacking his own team. Joseph Riccobene, Joe N. Gallo, his brothers, the Castellano branch of the family, Frank Scalice, and others whose loyalty was still negotiable. Some would rise, some would have to go. But like Vito, Gambino still answered to someone, Costello. And yet, slowly, the two men were building something more. A silent pact. A shared understanding. And Anastasia. He was becoming a problem. Gambino kept Vito in the loop, quietly feeding him details about Albert's erratic behavior. The press called him the Lord High Executioner. Behind closed doors he was slipping, paranoid, reckless, overreaching. He started stepping into territories that weren't his. He took liberties with men he shouldn't have touched. And the way Gambino played it, it started to look like a setup. But taking out Anastasia wasn't like clipping some street boss. He was still respected. By the commission, by Luciano, by the old guard. He had soldiers who'd kill for him. Men who still remembered Brooklyn in the 30s, who had blood on their hands from the old murder-incus days. Hitting him would be like starting a civil war inside the family. And God help anyone who crossed the blast zone. From exile in Italy, even Luciano could see what was coming. He kept close tabs on the growing storm. He knew Anastasia's days were numbered, but he also knew the chaos it could unleash. And Luciano hated chaos. Meanwhile, Meyer Lansky was building something else entirely. By the mid-50s, Lansky was a kingmaker on 3 fronts: money, politics, and geography. His grip on Miami was firm. In Detroit, he moved money through Joe Zerilli's son. In New Orleans, he operated with Phil Castile, carving up Louisiana's casinos with a soft voice and iron control. He made inroads with Carlos Marcello, though Marcello never fully trusted the Jewish side of the mob. Lansky didn't care. He never needed to be liked. He needed to be obeyed. Vegas, covered. He moved with Mo Dalitz, the Chicago outfit, and every New York family staking ground in the desert. He worked with the Maceos in Texas and Mickey Cohen in LA, extending his pipeline from California back to Havana, with stops in the Bahamas, Brazil, Mississippi, and beyond. Lansky wasn't just laundering money. He was engineering entire sectors of the underworld economy. He moved heroin, fixed casino ledgers, greased political campaigns, and built legitimate fronts like lobby firms and civil rights groups to shield his empire from scrutiny. His men handled millions in Havana, alone, feeding money through Russell Bufalino and John Martino straight into Swiss banks. But something in him was changing. Most mornings in Havana, Lansky's driver, Armando Jaime Casiles, would find him staring out at the sea near the main monument. The sun creeping up over the Malecon, the wind cutting through, and Lansky standing there, thinking. He wasn't afraid of Castro's rebels. Not yet. His fear was 5,000 miles away, in New York and Jersey, with men like Genovese and Anastasia circling each other like wolves. Jaime had come up hard, out of Jesus Maria, past trouble, into Vegas, then into Lansky's orbit. Lansky spotted him on the casino floor and brought him in. "You look like someone who can handle himself," he'd said. Jaime took the offer. When he arrived at the Hotel Nacional, Lansky greeted him like family, told him to get a bottle of Pernod, told him to pour one for himself. "You'll see how good it is." Jaime didn't know what to make of it. At first he thought Lansky was testing him, maybe even baiting him. But over time he realized this was just Meyer, a man too smart to play tough, too insulated to need muscle. But something was off. Lansky stopped eating like he used to, started drinking more, went silent for long stretches. Even Batista couldn't calm him down. Havana was on edge. Bombs were going off. The rebels were pushing in. Batista called it under control, but Lansky knew better. And the meetings he was holding, those weren't for Batista. They were for the mob. Every week, Jaime drove Lansky out to the estate of Joe, Hoboken Joe, Stasi, the ghost of the old New York underworld. A killer during the Prohibition days, a student of Rothstein, a man with deep ties to Luciano, Genovese, and every power player in between. Stasi ran Havana like a consigliere without a title. His base? The Hotel Plaza, once a high society jewel, now a mob HQ dressed in colonial elegance. The casino, co-owned with Philly boss Angelo Bruno, became the meeting ground for figures like Trafficante, the Cellini brothers, Wilbur Clark, and deep hitters from Cleveland, Miami, and Jersey. There was Thomas Blackjack McGinty, labor muscle turned casino boss. Charles the Blade Tureen, nightclub slickster turned Capri Hotel operator. And Nicholas the Fat Butcher di Costanzo, floor manager, terror in a suit, feared from Newark to Naples. And through it all, Lansky sat quietly, listening, calculating, watching the old order collapse under the weight of ambition and betrayal. The fight for power wasn't coming. It was already here. Armando Jaime never attended the mob's private sit-downs. His job was simple. Be there when Lansky called. Wait outside in the car. Run an errand. Stay invisible. But every now and then, the back seat of that Impala turned into a mobile war room. Lansky's men whispering about turf, money, threats. And one name kept floating through the cigarette smoke like a ghost. Anastasia. Even from the front seat, Jaime knew who that was. Back at Northwestern, he'd watched the Kefauver hearings with the rest of the country. Anastasia had been unmasked on national TV as the man behind Murder, Inc., a cold-eyed butcher from Brooklyn with a body count that haunted every corner of the commission. He was the kind of man whose name changed the air in a room. Even Meyer Lansky, who didn't scare easily, seemed rattled every time Anastasia came up. From what Jaime gathered, the storm was about money. Cuban money. Anastasia felt stiffed. He was demanding a larger piece of the Havana empire, and Lansky for once couldn't talk his way out of it. Their history went back decades. Both men came up through Luciano's inner circle. But where Lansky dealt in diplomacy, Anastasia dealt in blood. The man was a walking wrecking ball, known to blow up entire operations if he didn't like the math. Havana, for Lansky, had been a masterpiece, carefully curated, diversified, balanced. Anastasia was about to bulldoze it with 2 words. I'm owed. He wasn't subtle. At 5'8" and 210 pounds, Anastasia looked like an undertaker and moved like a tank. Every photo of him looked like a mugshot. His eyes were dark, his stare heavier than a coffin lid. Killing came easy to him. Investigators said he had a lot of skeletons in his closet. That was putting it gently. Anastasia had earned his power, the old violence and loyalty. He helped take out Joe the Boss Masseria back in '31, making room for Luciano's rise. In return, he got the Brooklyn docks, along with his brother, Tough Tony. During the war, their grip on the waterfront turned into a pipeline of money, blood, and stolen cargo. By the early 50s, men like Lansky thought they'd outgrown guys like Albert. Lansky wanted boardrooms. Anastasia wanted body bags. But by 1955, he was bleeding cash. The IRS dragged him into court on tax charges. First trial, hung jury. The retrial, different story. This time, they had a witness. A contractor named Charles Ferry, who worked on Anastasia's mansion. Then Ferry and his wife disappeared from their Miami home. The house was a bloodbath. No bodies. Next came Vincent Macri, a maid guy close to Anastasia. Found shot and stuffed in a Bronx trunk. His brother Benedicto vanished soon after. That made 4 witnesses. Gone. When the trial came, all the government had left were papers. Anastasia walked away with a slap, a minor tax plea, and less than a year in federal lockup. But prison changed him. Anastasia called for a meeting with the Havana partners. The venue, the Warwick Hotel in Manhattan. room 1009, booked by Anthony Capi Coppola, his shadow and driver. According to the New York Telegram and Sun, the suite was packed with American and Cuban players. And Albert didn't hold back. "Everybody's getting rich down there in Havana. Except me," he snapped. Someone tried to pacify him. "You've got Oriental Park." "Yeah," he shot back. "But the casinos. That's where the money is. And you know it." Lansky had seen this coming. Back at Joe Stassi's estate in Havana, the bosses had already gamed out a solution. They handed him a prize, the Hilton. The Havana Hilton was a monster. A 660-room beast, about to become the island's biggest hotel and casino. Giving up a cut of it would hurt, but keeping Anastasia happy was worth it. Albert nodded, visibly calmed. "That sounds good," he said. "I'll come down soon." "I haven't been back since '46. Lansky left, thinking he'd pulled it off. Another crisis handled. Anastasia had his piece. The Hilton was the pacifier. No blood spilled. He had no idea the clock was already ticking. While Cuba teetered on the edge, the American mob was boiling beneath the surface. Genovese had one goal: take the Luciano family for himself. And only two men stood in his way: Frank Costello and Albert Anastasia. Costello was slipping. The courts were on him. The bullet in his head, meant to kill, had only shaved his scalp but shattered his reign. Genovese was already making his moves. Anastasia, however, was a different animal. He wasn't just a rival. He was a live wire. Worse yet, he was back in Havana's orbit, poking around, throwing elbows. And that was a problem for men like Gambino. Carlo Gambino had built his power in the shadows. A quiet architect of influence, he'd stitched alliances across the country. Sam Giancana in Chicago, Russell Bufalino in Pennsylvania, Stefano Magaddino in Buffalo, Joe Zerilli in Detroit, Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, Tommy Lucchese in New York, and most importantly, Santo Trafficante in Florida and Havana. Gambino didn't roar. He whispered, and people listened. He knew Anastasia's temper, so he nudged him, subtly, encouraging him to challenge Trafficante's Havana control. Step on the wrong toes. Stir the pot. And it worked. Santo Trafficante wasn't loud, but he wasn't soft either. His secret weapon? Russell Bufalino, a quiet, dangerous strategist with roots deep in the old syndicate alliances. Bufalino and Magaddino had once worked with Anastasia back in the 40s, strong-arming dock workers, and a whole lot more across New York, New Jersey, and in Pennsylvania. Now they were lining up against him. Magaddino's support for Gambino was a signal. The Buffalo mob had chosen a side. Gambino wasn't just gunning for Anastasia, he was erasing a dynasty. But the danger wasn't just killing Albert. It was what came after: his men, his loyalists, his lieutenants. If Gambino weren't careful, the family could splinter into war. The old world was cracking. Names like Luciano still carried weight, but it was clear. The era of the founders was ending. A new breed was moving in, quieter, smarter, more vicious. Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, Joe Colombo, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Bonanno, Russell Bufalino, Sam Giancana. The Gallo brothers were heating up Brooklyn. Santo Trafficante Jr. had Florida locked. Carlos Marcello had Louisiana sewn tight. By the time the 60s arrived, the ground rules had changed, and so had the players. The mob was now a corporation. The face of crime had grown younger, slicker, hungrier. But in Naples, under curfew and under watch, Charles Lucky Luciano, the man who started it all, sat with a book in his hands. Shakespeare? Julius Caesar. He read it like scripture. Not for pleasure, though he admired the guy's style, but because he saw himself in it. "There's always a Cassius," he said once. "Everyone's got one. Mine? His name's Vito Genovese." Then, as if one weren't enough, "Come to think of it, I had two Cassiuses. The other one's Meyer Lansky, only I didn't see it till later." Back in '56, Naples was cold. Christmas lights glowed along the streets. Inside a quiet cafe, Luciano sat across from Joe Adonis. They didn't like each other, but that didn't matter. What mattered was New York. The streets were talking. Vito Genovese was making moves. Adonis had been deported. Costello was tied up in court, sweating tax charges. Lansky was bouncing between Havana and Miami. Nobody was watching Vito. Nobody with teeth, anyway. And Genovese was counting on that. Luciano knew what he was hearing. Genovese wasn't just pushing buttons. He was laying the groundwork. He was moving pieces. Guys loyal to Charlie were being benched. New faces were getting stripes. Tommy Eboli, for one. And under him, Tony Bender. It was a quiet coup. Adonis didn't say much. Nothing concrete, just danced around it, like he was protecting something, or someone. Maybe himself. Maybe Vito. Either way, Luciano didn't like the smell of it. "I knew how he felt about me ever since Zurich," Charlie said. "And I didn't have much love left for him either. But I thought, when it came to business back home, we were still partners." Eboli came later. Tommy Eboli. Once a boxing manager named Tommy Ryan, banned from the ring after he beat a ref half to death. Now he was running messages for Vito. Luciano never fully trusted him. The guy had a temper and a taste for the drug trade Charlie hated. But when Eboli showed up in Naples, he was respectful. Probably under orders. He brought a message from the council. Costello wanted out. Said he was too deep in legal trouble to run things. Wanted to retire, peacefully. "There's no such thing," Charlie said. "You get in, you stay in, unless you leave in a coffin." Still, Costello was different. He was one of the originals. Built it all with Luciano. If anyone earned an exception, it was him. According to Eboli, everyone had already voted yes. Anastasia, Lucchese, Joe Bananas, even Adonis. They just needed Luciano's vote to make it official. So why the double talk from Joe in the cafe? Charlie started thinking. Why didn't Adonis mention the vote? Why wait for Eboli to deliver the news? It didn't add up. "My nose tells me something stinks," he said. Luciano gave his vote, formally. Told Eboli to let Frank pick any house he wanted. But privately, he wrote a letter, mailed it through the US Army post, one last secret channel. Told Costello, "Send word. I need the truth." A month later, the reply came through Pat Eboli, Tommy's younger brother. Pat was different, reliable, trusted. Charlie had used him for years. Money, messages, even jars of pickles from New York, Pat delivered without fail. Pat met Costello at the Astoria. Got the word. Delivered it to Luciano himself. Frank's message was clear. "Tell Charlie I'm going to retire, even if it kills me." But that wasn't the real story. The real story was what Joe Bananas told Frank. Vito had been holding quiet meetings, feeling out loyalties. He didn't say what the fight was going to be about, but everybody knew. Genovese wanted the top seat, and he was getting ready to take it. Charlie read between the lines. Vito didn't care about the council vote. He wasn't waiting for permission. He was making his move. And Frank Costello was the first obstacle. Luciano had known this day was coming. Since his deportation, he left Costello in charge. But now Frank wanted out. Adonis was gone. Lucchese and Anastasia were busy with their own families. Suddenly, Charlie was alone. And Vito? Vito was restructuring the family, clearing out Luciano loyalists, installing guys who'd kiss the ring. Meanwhile, Frank was in survival mode, focused on staying out of prison. His money, casino shares in Vegas, real estate all over Manhattan, was supposed to be clean. He wanted to live off it, retire like a legit businessman. But Vito wasn't having it. Luciano heard what happened at the council meeting. Vito stood up and said there was only one way a guy could retire: in a box. Then Lansky spoke up, said Frank had earned the right to peace. That's when Vito made his move. He offered a compromise. Frank could leave, but he had to put everything into a pot. Let the New York bosses decide his pension. It was bullshit, and Charlie knew it. This wasn't about money. It was personal. Vito never forgot that night at the Claridge Hotel, when Frank humiliated him. When Genovese wanted to bring Dutch Schultz into the fold, and Costello shot it down like he was talking to a waiter. That humiliation festered for years. Now Vito had his chance to pay it back. Then Charlie's brother Bart showed up in Naples, fresh off a meeting in New York. He brought cash, and a message from Albert Anastasia. There'd been another sit-down. Vito laid it out. He was going to be the boss. Albert didn't flinch. "You'll be the boss of nothing," he told him. "I set this whole thing up in 31 so nobody could take over. You try it. You'll be sorry." Then Bart gave the final piece. Lansky tried to cool things down. Said if Frank went to prison, maybe that was the solution. No need for blood. Vito liked the sound of that. Said, "Fine, let him take the rap. Let him rot. No help, no protection." Charlie saw it for what it was. Genovese was throwing out the rules. The old code: help your guys when they're down, take care of their families. None of it meant anything anymore. Now it was just about power. Luciano kept his brother out of it. Too risky. This wasn't like the old days. This was personal, and it was war. And in that war, Vito Genovese had already lit the match. By the spring of 1957, Charlie Luciano had made a decision. The less he knew, the safer he was. Something in his gut told him Anastasia's threats to Genovese weren't going to sit quiet. He wanted his brother Bart out of it, out of the loop, out of the danger. So he sent him home, told him to keep his head down in the garment district and not to talk to anybody. Charlie had been thinking of sending a message to Chinky Vitality in Brooklyn, something vague, a feeler about Albert. But before he could, news came in from New York. The council had turned on Vito. Against all odds, they'd backed Charlie's original idea. Frank Costello could retire clean, keep his money, lose his council vote. Simple, elegant, controlled. It was a win, but Charlie wasn't celebrating. He didn't trust Genovese for a second. Vito had just been publicly humiliated. Worse, he'd been cornered. Charlie knew what that meant. Vito had to make a move now, and he did. He cut a deal with Carlo Gambino, whack Anastasia, get promoted. What Genovese didn't see coming? Gambino wasn't just looking to take out Anastasia. He wanted both of them gone, Vito and Albert. All of them. He wasn't playing for a piece anymore. He was playing for the whole board. Charlie, who once believed in peace between the families, now understood peace in New York was a myth, a con. The Italians? They didn't fight the enemy. They fought each other. And the Neapolitans? They stabbed each other in the back. "You know the difference between the Jews and the Italians," he once said. "The Jews kill for each other, the Italians kill each other. And the fucking Neapolitans? They kill each other in the back." And just when he thought he'd seen it all, Charlie found out Genovese had ordered a hit on him. Not just Costello. Luciano. Vito wasn't just erasing the past. He wanted to rewrite it. Frank was step 1. Luciano, step 2. With Charlie out of the way, nobody stood between Vito and full control. And for that, he turned to his rising star, Tony Bender. Bender was Genovese's muscle, recently promoted, but even he didn't want to get his hands bloody. So he passed it off to someone younger, hungrier, easier to manipulate. Vincent, the Chin Gigante. Luciano didn't think much of him. Just a kid. A second-rate boxer with a glass jaw. But to Vito, Gigante was family. Almost literally. The bond between them was strange. Almost father-son. When Gigante messed up the Costello hit, Vito didn't punish him. He forgave him, protected him, kept him close. Vincent Gigante wasn't just some muscle off the street. He was handpicked. The Eboli crew had their hooks in him early. Patsy Eboli, Tommy Eboli, Mike Miranda, they all backed him, used him. When the heat turned up in the early 50s and the bosses needed clean hands, they turned to guys like Gigante. Ex-boxers with broken noses and stone loyalty. He ran their errands, collected debts, sent messages no one wanted in writing. He was a hitter who didn't ask questions. But Vincent was different. He wasn't just a soldier. He listened, watched, obsessed over Genovese. Whatever Vito said, he followed the letter. The old man saw it, started pulling him closer. Vincent wasn't just muscle anymore. He was being groomed. A student, a future player. All he had to do was stay loyal, prove himself to Tommy Eboli, and most of all, to Vito. On May 2nd, he made his move. Frank Costello had no idea he was being hunted. That night, he was at the Peacock Lounge, drinking with Frank Erickson and little Augie Carfano. The key for the hearings had messed everything up. The press was relentless. The feds were worse. Costello was up to his neck in tax problems. Around 11 p.m., he got in a cab, headed to his apartment at 115 Central Park West. What he didn't know was that Gigante had slipped in before him, waiting behind a pillar in the lobby. When Costello stepped through the door, Gigante stepped out and said, "This is for you, Frank." He pulled the trigger. The bullet grazed Costello's head, ripped open his scalp, but didn't kill him. Gigante didn't stick around to check. He bolted. Didn't even look back. Costello, dazed and bleeding, made it to the hospital. Doctors found $8,000 cash in his coat and a slip of paper, gambling IOUs and casino wins. That slip triggered another storm, a new investigation that tied Costello to Vegas operations, including the Tropicana. Costello never named the shooter. He kept his mouth shut. So did the doorman, who described the shooter as a fat man, and later couldn't identify Gigante in court. Behind the scenes, Vito made sure Gigante disappeared, got him out of the country. When he came back, he was thinner, looked different, clean getaway. At trial, Costello testified he couldn't ID the shooter. That was enough. Gigante walked. As he passed Costello in the hallway, he said one thing. "Thank you, Frank." Luciano? He heard about it the next day. "I was in Montecatini with a Jaya," he said later. "Something wrong with my back. Baths helped. Morning of May 3rd, the Guardia picks me up. They brought him to the barracks, asked why he tried to have Frank Costello killed. He told them straight, "I didn't know anything until you just told me." But from what I hear, whoever did it was a lousy shot. Back in the States, Vito was already preparing for war. Holed up in his Highlands estate with 40 armed guards. He called in members from the Luciano family, looking for support. One man refused. Little Augie Carfano. Within 2 years, Carfano was dead, on Genovese's orders. Then came the killing of Frank Scalice, underboss to Anastasia. Scalise had opposed Vito's push and backed Costello. A month later, he was shot dead. The triggerman? Vincent Squillante. Same guy who slit the throat of Scalise's brother and dumped the body. Joe Valachi would later finger Anastasia for the hit, but Luciano and others knew better. It was Genovese. Vito was cleaning house, one by one. From his exile in Italy, Luciano could only watch. Newspapers, whispered messages, letters smuggled across oceans. "Yeah," he said. "It was all over the papers." Frank laid up in the hospital. Igea wouldn't let me out of her sight after that. And Luciano? Furious. If Florita hadn't lifted my passport, I'd have been on the next plane to Switzerland. I'd have found a way back into the States, and I'd have handled that little bastard Veto myself. But he couldn't move. The Italian cops were on him. His wife was watching him like a hawk. And the New York underworld, his creation, was on fire. The storm was building. You could feel it in the air. New York was on edge, and in the humid back alleys of Louisiana, Carlos Marcello was fuming. The hit on Frank Costello didn't just echo in Manhattan. It rattled windows all the way down in the bayou. Marcello saw it for what it was, a shot at the old guard. And Frank was the old guard. Marcello had been climbing since the 40s, quietly, efficiently. By the time most of America forgot about Prohibition, Marcello was running Louisiana. No debate. But Louisiana wasn't clean turf. It was a mess of Italian crews, some old school, some hungry. The 5 families back in New York, mainly Costello and Meyer Lansky, made the call. Marcello would run point, their guy down south. A boss, yes, but also a puppet. Problem was, Marcello wasn't built to be anyone's puppet. The power got to him, fast. He wasn't just running rackets, he was controlling politicians, judges, ports. A monster had been created. And like everything in the Mafia, once you gave a man that kind of weight, it didn't come back. The structure in New York was simple. No one made a serious move without clearing it with the commission. You had to get the nod. Marcello. He played by his own rules. Oldest family in the South. Deep roots. Deep pockets. He wasn't just tied to blood. He was wired into everyone. Even Frank Costello had to tread lightly. As the 60s crept in, Marcello's world started to shift. New players were moving in, Phil Dandy Catel, Seymour Weiss, and a whole line of Jewish gangsters with bloodlines that ran straight back to Arnold Rothstein. The casino game exploded, and under Marcello's watch, Louisiana turned into a cash machine. Everyone had a piece. The money was easy, the stakes were high, and the whole underworld felt like it was about to tip. Marcello was no fool. He'd inspired Bugsy Siegel's Flamingo project in Vegas, but he wasn't chasing headlines. He knew what happened when you reached too far. So he stayed in the shadows, let other guys take the fall. But he made one thing clear. Frank Costello was off limits. The shooting didn't sit right. You didn't touch a man like Frank, not without consequences. Marcello had become king in the South. From the swamp to the strip, he controlled who got in, who got out, and who got buried. When Vito Genovese tried to cool the tension, he upped his narcotics game, cut Marcello in directly. It was a bribe, plain and simple, and it worked. For a while. Then came Cuba. It was a powder keg. Castro needed guns. Batista needed backing. The Mafia played both sides. Money, weapons, intel. Everyone got their hands dirty. Even the CIA. And the mob? They found a new front in the Caribbean. Havana became the next Vegas. The next empire. Lucky Luciano, watching from exile, saw the walls closing in. He had built this thing from scratch. Prohibition, unions, casinos, heroin. Now it was turning into something else. Global, violent, out of control. In a few years he'll be dead. But in that moment, he knew what was coming. Narcotics would change everything. Back in New York, the hit on Costello changed the whole game. Gigante blew it, but it was enough. Enough to force a conversation. A meeting happened. Longy's Vilman's house in Jersey. Just Frank and Vito. No muscle. No audience. Frank sent me word about it later, Luciano recalled. Vito told him, don't do nothing. Don't complain to nobody. And most of all, do not go to Charlie Lucky with this thing. Because if you do, you're going to start a war. In that case, I promise you'll be the first one dead. Frank had no choice. They cut a deal. The shadows stretched long across the country. These weren't street hoods anymore. These were men who shaped industries, newspapers, politics. The White House didn't move without someone whispering in the dark. But after Costello got clipped, the veil started to lift. People were paying attention. A quiet empire, years in the making, started to crack open. Men like Marcello, Trafficante, Anastasia, Genovese, and Luciano had built something bigger than they ever imagined. But the Costello shooting was a line in the sand. A boss got shot. That hadn't happened since the days of Maranzano. It signaled a new era, one ruled by bullets, not votes. J. Edgar Hoover, who once laughed off the idea of a mafia, was now sweating under the lights. The McClellan Committee pulled him in. Then came Joseph Valachi. He flipped the table, named names, told stories the public never dreamed were true. The facade was crumbling. Amid the chaos, Frank Costello saw the future, and he wanted no part of it. He didn't want revenge. He wanted peace. So he set another private meeting with Genovese. Veto was boxed in. Too much heat, too many enemies. Costello had the upper hand. Luciano remembered the moment clearly. What choice did Frank have? He said he'd drop the whole thing, and Veto agreed to let him retire like he wanted, with all his gambling and real estate. Of course, around that time, Frank got convicted on tax charges. Did a couple years. But after that, he went up to Sands Point and started clipping coupons. The attack on Costello sent shockwaves through the underworld. A boss nearly killed. It shattered the illusion that things were under control. Frank had never asked to be boss of bosses, but when Luciano went down, he filled the seat. Quietly, respectfully. Now, someone had tried to take his head off. Luciano, sitting half a world away, knew it was a turning point. The balance of power had shifted. The old world was gone, and what came next would be blood. When Frank Costello took a bullet to the head and lived, the streets of New York shuddered. There hadn't been a direct shot fired at a boss since the days of Castellammare and Masseria. This wasn't business as usual. This was war. Costello hadn't asked to be capo di tutti capi. He operated like a chairman on Luciano's behalf, not a king. But now the piece that Charlie built was splintering, and the trigger man, Vincent the Chin Gigante, had just sent a very public message. The moment Charlie got the news in Italy, he knew what it meant. So I drove down to Rome and sent a letter to Meyer through an APO of a friend of mine and told him to send somebody over right away. Before Meyer even got the letter, who shows up in Naples but Tommy Eboli? He didn't beat around the bush. He tells me he's coming straight from Veto, and Veto says there has to be peace and I shouldn't start nothing. Then that stupid Eboli throws me a little toe of his own. He advises me to take it easy, and everything is going to be fine. I told him to go fuck himself with his advice and run back to Veto and tell him the day has not come yet when the runt can take me in no kind of fight. Eboli looks at me with his eyes wide open and says, a little nervous, "Charlie, are you sure you want me to tell that to Veto?" So I looked at him and laughed. Then I went to the door and held it open for him and told him, "Tommy, you ain't a bad kid, but your trouble is you're not like your brother. You're the one who must learn to take it easy." Charlie knew what was happening. He was on the board again, whether he wanted to be or not. He tightened his inner circle in Italy. Only old allies like Fernando Alotti, Momo Salemi, Joe Di Giorgio. No outsiders. Not now. The next visitor wasn't from Meyer. It was Paul Gambino, Carlo's brother. Paul told me exactly what happened about Vito's attempt to eliminate Frank, and the deal Veto and Frank made afterwards. Then he tells me that the way things are going, it looks like Anastasia is going to have serious trouble, very soon. I was sure he was acting in the interest of Albert because his brother was Albert's solid right hand, or so I thought. So I told him to get back to New York right away and have Albert call the council together. Everybody except Veto. Albert was to tell them that I approved a hit on Veto. I suggested they keep the meeting secret, someplace private like Atlantic City, where they could look like tourists, and nobody would know why they were there. I emphasized to Gambino to tell Albert, in this case, he was acting for me, and to do it exactly like I said. What Charlie didn't know was this. Paul wasn't speaking for Albert. He was speaking for Carlo. Luciano was playing chess. Gambino was playing Go. Veto was just a pawn in a bigger endgame, one that would end with Anastasia dead and Gambino wearing the crown. Charlie wouldn't see it until it was too late. But when he did, he couldn't help but admire it. He'd played the same move on Maranzano. He respected the game. His problem was with Veto. I figured Albert got my message right away, and I'm waiting to hear that he's called the council, and they have okayed what I suggested. I could not see any reason for them not to approve it, because it was the unwritten rule that if any head of the family ever put the rest of us in real danger, he had to go. But if Albert did get my message, that stupid hot-headed bastard must have decided not to follow it, because the next thing I hear is that he is going after Veto himself, on his own. By that point, Anastasia was really off his rocker. He just wanted to kill anybody who came to his mind that he got mad about. He was starting to see himself like some guy in the old gangster movies, like Jimmy Cagney. For Christ's sake, he even had that kid Arnold Schuster knocked off because he was seen bragging on television about how he spotted the bank robber Willie Sutton and tipped off the police officers. By early June, Luciano got word, a contract on his life, ordered by Veto. The message came via an associate of Longhi Zwilman, who visited Luciano while in Europe for health treatments. So, at that point, I had to outmaneuver Veto. Knowing that little bastard like the back of my hand, there was one thing I was sure of. He would not be coming at me from the front. It would have to be some kind of angle, some guy sneaking up from behind. I spent a couple of days trying to wear Genovese's shoes, and then it comes to me. 9 chances out of 10 how he's going to do it. The son of a bitch knows how much I love cars, and that I am always fooling around with motors. So if he's going to get me, then the easiest way would be something connected with my car. At the end of Via Tasso sat a modest garage where Luciano spent his afternoons tinkering with his Alfa Romeo. The mechanic became a friend. But now, the ritual became necessity. Every day, bumper-to-bumper checks. Gas tank, trunk, undercarriage. At night, they repeated the routine in the private garage behind his apartment. No shortcuts. No assumptions. One night, Charlie and his crew walked into an ambush. 2 men with lead pipes. Salemi clipped across the shoulders. The mechanic, too small to help, got tossed. But Fernando leveled both attackers like a linebacker. Guns came out, but nobody fired. They knew cops were watching Charlie. They were here to scare, not to kill, yet. Charlie cracked their passports. Fake. When he interrogated them, they wouldn't talk, claimed to be good Italians. I was ready to kill those 2 right there. But I cooled off. I figured I'd send a message. He let them live. Barely. Busted and bruised, they got a direct order. Tell Veto if he starts a war, it'll be like dropping an atom bomb. And as long as I'm alive, he'll never sit on the throne. Luciano walked them to the airport in Rome himself. First-class tickets. No fuss. They vanished into the sky. He never saw them again. I didn't expect to. I could have handled Veto myself, but I made the rules. I set up the outfit. I couldn't be the one to break them. If Veto were going to go, like I told Albert after the hit on Frank, it would have to be legal by order of the council, according to our rules. But not everything could be fixed by rules. Charlie kept the attempt from his wife. No need to burden Igea. But she saw it. Something changed in him. Or maybe something was changing in her. What Charlie didn't know was that she was quietly fighting a battle of her own. Breast cancer. He chalked up her distance to fear, for him. but she was preparing for something far more private and painful. While Charlie tried to survive a war on the streets, Igea was battling a war inside her body. Neither of them said anything. The silence stretched. In the quiet corridors of Naples, the old lion watched the empire he built shift under his feet. Gambino was moving, Veto was hunting, and Luciano, caught in the middle, was still playing by the rules of a game that everyone else had stopped following. But he had one advantage. He'd seen it all before, and he hadn't lost his touch. By 1957, the walls were closing in on Albert Anastasia. The entire decade had been a slow-motion collapse. First, he lost Mangano, then Moretti. Then key figures around him started disappearing, one after another. Men like Jimmy Lumia in Florida, gunned down in the street. Men like Willie Moretti, shot in the mouth for talking too much. The groundwork for a war was there, and it was spreading fast. And still, Anastasia kept swinging, like a fighter who didn't know he was already out on his feet. Then came the government. The key for the hearings had already rattled the underworld in the early 1950s, but now the new threat came from Washington. In 1957, two senators, John McClellan of Arkansas and Irving Ives of New York, were fighting for control over a $250,000 Senate investigation into labor racketeering. The stakes weren't just political, they were criminal. The Senate was now naming names. Such well-known criminals as the notorious John DioGuardi, alias Johnny Dio, his brother Tommy DioGuardi, Albert Anastasia, notorious as one of the gunmen of Murder, Inc., and reputed to be involved in a large number of unsolved murders. That was printed in the Star Ledger on January 9th. If Anastasia read it over his coffee, he would have nearly choked. Albert Anastasia was no stranger to headlines, but this was different. The feds weren't just investigating him. They were building a case around him, around the garment industry, around his reach into the unions. They wanted blood. He pled the fifth, said his eyesight was failing, said he was too sick to testify. Maybe his eyes were hurting because now they were going to put a mirror to him and his sins, and he couldn't bear to look. More likely, he just didn't care, because by then, even his own men were becoming a problem. Anastasia's crew had become a cabal of true believers. These weren't soldiers, they were fanatics, sadists, men who worshipped him, followed orders without question. And in a world where control mattered more than loyalty, that kind of devotion was dangerous. Luciano saw it too. From Naples, Charlie was watching the empire crack in slow motion. When he sent word to Anastasia, call the council, get ahead of this, isolate Veto, he believed it would happen. But instead of going to Albert, Paul Gambino took the message straight to Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese. It was a setup. Veto knew that if Luciano wanted to declare war, he needed allies. That meant neutralizing anyone who could rally the commission. Fast. The Manganos were gone. Moretti was gone. Now Anastasia was isolated, and the politicians were circling like sharks. On January 7, 1957, the Star Ledger published a headline that would make any boss reach for his pills. Two Senate investigating groups clash over $250,000 labor racket probe. McClellan was claiming jurisdiction for his committee. He already had Anastasia's name on the record. He said his investigators had found collusion between dishonest union officials and violent underworld figures. Ives, the New York senator, countered that his committee should lead the charge. Beneath the surface, both men wanted to crack the garment district. And that meant putting Anastasia under the microscope. In a rare executive session the year prior, Albert had denied everything. No financial ties to contractors, no knowledge of shoddy army clothing deals, no interest in any fraud. He was lying. Behind the scenes, he had his hooks deep into the quartermaster corps, funneling inferior materials and cutting corners for profit. Shady unions, crooked contractors, and bribed army officers. It was all part of the same machine. Shoddy work and inferior materials were part and parcel of the plan. The garment district itself was a jungle. 20 square blocks from Times Square to Penn Station. Racketeers called the shots. If you wanted to ship dresses out of Midtown, you paid a tax. If you wanted protection from theft or from union headaches, you paid another tax. If you didn't, you got a visit. The names read like a rap sheet of underworld royalty: Arnold Rothstein, Legs Diamond, Lepke Buchalter, Tony Ducks Corallo, Johnny Dio Guardi, and yes, Albert Anastasia. The mob owned the trucks. They owned the Teamsters. They even tried to own City Hall. As one federal official put it, "This is industrial racketeering at the highest level. 50 million a year, maybe 100. Anastasia's power came from those rackets and the blood that protected them. But by 1957, that blood was drawing too much attention. The unions were being called to testify. So were contractors. So were the bosses. 6 grand juries were convened, federal, state, county, all pointing in the same direction. And still, Albert doubled down. He had a man, Benedict Macri, accused in the 1919 stabbing of an ILGWU organizer. That case vanished. Witnesses forgot what they saw. One went blind. Another disappeared. It was old school. Murder, Inc. Politics. The kind that worked in the 30s, but not now. Frank Hogan, Manhattan's district attorney, called it plainly, "These are the graduates magna cum laude of the old Lepke school." By summer, Luciano knew Albert wasn't going to make it. He was too visible, too erratic. He'd ordered the murder of Arnold Schuster just for recognizing a bank robber on TV. That wasn't business. That was insanity. Anastasia was really off his rocker. He thought he was some guy in a Jimmy Cagney movie. What made it worse? He was isolated. Carlo Gambino, his supposed underboss, was already plotting behind his back. Anastasia didn't even see it coming. New York was cracking at the seams. Lucky Luciano, the man who built the commission, was stranded in exile. Italy, cold and unfamiliar, wasn't a kingdom. It was a prison. He was broke. His wife was sick. The old rackets were falling apart, and he couldn't pull a string without someone yanking back. Interpol had him boxed in. The narcotics division kept their boots on his neck. Charles Siragusa, Harry Anslinger. They wanted him ruined, and they were relentless. Every time a body dropped in the States, Luciano got hauled in. They'd question him, search him, trail him. Surveillance, pressure, and isolation never let up. The empire was burning. The old-timers were dying off or disappearing. The next wave, young, hungry, cold, were already carving up the leftovers. And then came the blood. June 17th, 1957. The Bronx. A humid, sticky afternoon. Frank Scalice, Don Cheech, the patriarch, stepped out of a corner grocery store with a handful of change and a small brown bag. His pants were black, gaudy, and full of swagger. He stuffed $72 and some coins into his pocket and started down the steps. He never made it to the sidewalk. 2 men brushed past Enrico Mazzaro, the shop's owner. No coats, sleeves rolled up, like they belonged on a work site. 5 quick shots in the open air. Scalice went down hard hit in the larynx, the cheek, the shoulder, and the neck. The bag tore open. Bills and silver spilled over the pavement. Blood soaked into the fruit juice. The shooters slipped into an old black sedan, waiting double-parked out front. Gone in seconds. North on Arthur Avenue. No plates, no faces, ghosts. The neighborhood, tight-knit, Italian and tuned into the street, erupted. People poured out of buildings. They knew Scalice. They knew who he was. Cops held back his brothers, Thomas, Philip, Jack, trying to get to the body. Jack's candy shop was just up the block. He arrived first. All 3 were questioned. The press had a field day. Scalise wasn't just some local hood. He was connected, deeply. Photos found at his Bronx home showed him arm in arm with Luciano in Italy. Dozens of them. The kind of pictures you don't leave lying around unless you think you're untouchable. Or you've run out of people to hide from. Scalise, 53 years old, called himself a contractor. That was the word he used when the cops came knocking. In truth, he was a shadow player with direct lines to men like Frank Costello and the old Sicilian Guard. To law enforcement, he was big, a primary suspect in the car trunk murder of Vincent Macri in 1954 and the vanishing of his brother Benedetto. Nobody could pin him down, but everyone knew he had blood on his hands. He was also a suspect in narcotics. Major suspect. In 1955, the Senate tried to drag him into testimony during their probe of international drug smuggling. He kept quiet. Always. But the heat never left. By the time of his death, Scalise had become the kind of man who was only seen when it was already too late. His Cadillac, a bright yellow coupe from 1956, was found just 2 blocks away near his brother's place. Another piece of flash, another breadcrumb in the city's underworld puzzle. Assistant DA Albert Blinder said what everyone was already thinking. This had all the earmarks of a gangland hit. Scalice's death was clean, surgical, and timed. This wasn't street beef. It was strategy. Blinder suspected a connection to the international heroin trade, and he wasn't alone. The murder didn't just spark headlines. It sent shockwaves across the entire syndicate structure. The old 5 families weren't isolated anymore. New York touched Detroit. Detroit was tied to New Orleans. Florida, Chicago, the Midwest, they were all woven into the same racket. Heroin, numbers, union money, and political grease. Now they were turning on each other. Luciano felt it from across the ocean. Every killing in New York dragged his name back into the spotlight. Everybody left behind came with a knock on his door. He couldn't move. He couldn't act. The people he trusted were relics, prohibition ghosts. The new players didn't know him, didn't need him, didn't owe him. The Scalise hit? That was more than a power play. That was the start of a purge. And New York had just turned into open season. As bodies fell and names disappeared from ledgers, the city kept moving. The street swept the blood, cops took statements, and the papers burned through headlines. But nobody said what they really knew. Not out loud. Scalise was gone, buried with a requiem mass, sealed in Holy Sepulchre. Family wept, brothers were questioned, and the case went cold on paper. But the silence wasn't forgetfulness. It was fear. Everyone in the Bronx knew why Don Ciccio died. They just didn't say it. Then, 2 years later, the stories started leaking. July 1st, 1959. Tucson Citizen runs a headline. Brotherhood of Evil, mafioso killed for muffing deal. Now the world heard what the street already knew. Scalise's murder wasn't just a gangland dispute. It was mafia enforcement, carried out with military precision and centuries of tradition. His execution had been ordered by his own, approved, authorized, and implemented for one reason. He broke the code. He blew a heroin deal. The story spelled it out, clear as day. Sometime before the shooting, Scalice, Don Ciccio, called a meeting. Select men, trusted men. The kind of room where no one wrote anything down, and the handshake was binding. The proposal was old school, heavy money, 20 kilograms of heroin, fresh off a boat from Naples. Luciano would greenlight it from Italy. The SS Gambino would carry it to New York. Huge profit, fast turnover, everyone in. But it went bad. The Gambino was under surveillance. Feds, customs, and narcotics had it red flagged. The couriers got scared. The heroin stayed on board through 3 full trips. Scalise tried to reroute the shipment to a different ship out of Marseille, but a port officer saw a sack tossed off the side and called it in. The ship reversed course. The dope was recovered by the Spanish. No profit, no product, just heat. And when heat hits, someone pays. In the Mafia, if you build the deal, you take the loss. It doesn't matter how. It doesn't matter why. You make restitution, fast, or you make a funeral. Don Ciccio promised to pay. He stalled. The debt didn't disappear. But he did. By 1959, the papers were printing what had once only travelled by whisper. The hit had been sanctioned at the highest levels. A formal gathering of aggrieved partners, a tribunal of ranking mafiosi, a vote. Then came the letter, always in code, always through family. A cousin or uncle in Chicago or Detroit would get the call. 2 good men, quiet, efficient, disposable. They arrived in New York like ghosts. They didn't knock. They didn't show up at clubs or bars. They studied. Days, weeks. Scalice was paranoid. He knew the rules as well as anyone. His home on City Island was too hot. His daily drives were too fast. But his walk on Arthur Avenue, that was clockwork. They waited. June 17th. Bronx heat. Mazzaro's fruit stand. A flash of yellow slacks. A $5 bill. 2.38, 5 shots. Blood on the concrete. 2 years later, the Brotherhood's hand was exposed. But no one got indicted. No witnesses. No trial. Just a newspaper article, and a city still scared to say his name out loud. And for the Mafia, it was business as usual. 2 years after the murder, newspapers like the Tucson Citizen started cracking open the lid. Scalise hadn't just muffed a heroin deal, he was executed by his own men under the full weight of Mafia law. But it didn't stop there. As the years rolled forward, more pieces surfaced. More whispers turned into names. And some of those names were still in the game. 1968, January 28th, Tulsa World. The story dropped like a quiet bomb. A man named Cara, an old-school Mafia hitman turned government informant, was talking. 70 years old, hiding under a fake name, dying of throat cancer. He didn't want revenge. He wanted a clean conscience. Cara laid it out in Parade magazine like he was recounting a golf game. He said Anastasia, Albert Anastasia, the Mad Hatter, the executioner behind Murder, Inc., had orchestrated Scalise's murder too. Not just sanctioned it, framed him for it. According to Cara, Scalise's mistake wasn't just the heroin deal. It was that he was in Anastasia's way. A rival, a threat. And Anastasia had done it before. Vincenzo Mangano, head of the Mangano family before it became the Gambino family, was also set up by Anastasia. Mangano had started asking questions, trying to reel in his ambitious underboss. So Anastasia staged a doctored recording. Got the okay from the Fratellanza in Sicily, the old world bosses whose word still carried weight in the US. Once the nod came through, Mangano was invited to a house out on Long Island. He never left. His body, according to Cara, was fed through a garbage truck owned by Vincent Squillante, another Anastasia loyalist with a private sanitation company and a reputation for making people vanish. No grave, no questions, just trash. Scalise? Same story. Different setup. Cara claimed Anastasia had Scalise framed with counterfeit money, made it look like he was passing bad bills tied to a botched dope shipment. That, combined with the heroin disaster, gave Anastasia cover. He could tell the commission, this guy's radioactive, and they let it happen. The shooters were greenlit. The timing was perfect. And in June 1957, Scalice went down with coins in his hand and a bullet in his throat. By October, Anastasia was dead too, cut down in a Manhattan barbershop chair, gunned down in broad daylight. A hit so bold it rewrote mob history. But now, with Cara talking, the pieces looked different. Scalice's murder wasn't just about debt. It was about control. Mangano, Scalice. Anyone in Anastasia's way was neutralized. And the street never got the full story, until guys like Kara, dying and full of regret, started connecting the dots. He talked about secret graves in the Northeast, another one near Galveston, Texas. He said Luciano only turned narcotics into a machine after he got deported. That's when the smuggling got industrialized. Army ships, civilian couriers, heroin coming through Brooklyn ports like it was flour. He talked about the fratellanza, the deep Sicilian connection, old blood that still had said over who lived and who disappeared. Kara said every boss in America operated independently, but the roots, the rituals, the final decisions, those still came from Sicily. And the Scalise hit. That was old school. That was fratellanza approved. Kara didn't flinch when he said it. To him, it wasn't betrayal. It was bookkeeping. It took years to crack open the silence, but when Dominic Montiglio finally talked, he tore the lid off a secret that had been buried inside his family for decades. Frank Scalise and his brother Joe hadn't just vanished into mob folklore. They were taken out, eliminated, by a man with blood on his hands and garbage on his payroll. Vincent Jimmy Squillante. Jimmy wasn't just another trigger man. He was Albert Anastasia's godson, a loyal soldier, trusted enough to kill for him, ambitious enough to dream bigger. By November 1957, he wasn't just playing the game. He was running part of the board. The newspapers had a name for him: the Garbage King. Federal agents called him something else: a racket boss in a $50 million a year industry. On November 22, 1957, Squillante was grabbed by the feds. Charged with extortion, he stood next to his brother Nunzio and an associate, Carmen de Cabia, president of a carting employer group. All three were nailed in a late-night indictment tied to garbage contracts at Mitchell Air Force Base. Prosecutors said a man named Angelo Recchia used to haul garbage for $3,900 a year, until Squillante's crew leaned on him and made him surrender the job or get crushed. At arraignment in Nassau County Court, Jimmy's bail was set at $30,000. The other two got $10,000 each. The government was watching him closely. They already had him in their sights. A week earlier, he'd sat in front of a Senate committee on labor racketeering and taken the fifth. Refused to say a word. This was just days after the infamous Appalachian Summit, where the country learned the Mafia wasn't fiction. It was infrastructure. The feds knew Anastasia's murder in a Manhattan barbershop weeks earlier wasn't random. The men at Appalachian were being questioned, and Jimmy Squillante's name was circling the drain. He wasn't just in the garbage business. He was in the business of silence, and the men who enforced it. After the indictments dropped, police moved fast. Bench warrants were issued. Jimmy was picked up at his home on Gleason Avenue in the Bronx. He had never done time before. At 5 feet 1.5 inches, he dressed like a nightclub crooner, all shine and polish, but the look masked a killer's heart. He was due in federal court days later for a hearing about his probation on a tax charge. The feds wanted to yank it and lock him up. By 1960, the walls were closing in. But Jimmy didn't get taken down by the law. He was taken out by his own, whacked by Nino Gaggi and the Roy DeMeo crew. Nino waited for permission, waited for the heat to cool. When it did, he made his move. Squillante was shot, stuffed in a trunk, and torched. Cremated. No body, no funeral, no trial. Just gone. Carlo Gambino, now sitting at the top of the pyramid, was done with the men who helped him climb. Nino was Frank Scalise's replacement, and Scalise had been clipped too. Gambino wasn't sentimental. He replaced everyone with a new inner circle. Trusted men, quiet men. Men who didn't ask questions. Then came the headlines. Hunt for Squillante. Judge revokes bail. September 30th, 1960. Squillante disappears, vanishes into thin air. His lawyer reports him missing. Rumors fly. A gangland ride. Maybe. Maybe not. The assistant DA says, "We're assuming he's alive." But nobody believes that. He'd failed to appear in court for his extortion trial. Judge Paul Widlitz revoked his bail. $31,000 on the line. The bail bondsman begged for time. If the bond were forfeited, 2 homes and a Bronx funeral parlor used as collateral would go under. Widlitz gave him 2 weeks. If Jimmy turned up dead, the bond would be safe. If not, people were going to lose everything. The DA wanted immediate forfeiture. Jimmy's lawyer argued that Squillante had no reason to run. His last conviction had been overturned. He said Jimmy had nothing to fear. But nobody had seen Jimmy since 2 p.m. September 30th at a bar near his house in the Bronx. Nunzio showed up in court, said he didn't know where his brother was. Asked if he thought Jimmy was dead, he said, "I'd only be guessing." Law enforcement launched a citywide search. New York and Long Island cops were all on alert, but there was no sign of him. The warrant squad started combing for clues, hoping to answer the question everyone in the underworld already knew. Was Jimmy Squillante a bail jumper, or just another ghost in a long line of gangland dead? They never found the body. They never needed to. In the world Jimmy came from, cremation meant closure. No remains, no case, no questions. Just silence. Dominic Montiglio grew up in Levittown, Long Island, but his education didn't come from books or classrooms. It came from one man, his uncle, Nino Gaggi. Nino wasn't just a gangster. He was the gangster. Quiet, respected, feared. He didn't announce himself when he walked into a room. He didn't have to. People felt it. Even in a bathrobe, the man wore the life like a second skin. Dominic idolized him. One day in elementary school, the teacher stepped out. As class president, Dominic did what he was supposed to, jotted down the names of the kids acting up. Later, he told Nino. His uncle just looked at him. "You wrote down names?" "Yeah. You just told me you're a stool pigeon." Dominic resigned the next day. No questions. That was the moment it hit him. What his family really was. Every week they visited Brooklyn. Each time there was a new car, a new coat. Before sending him home, Nino always slipped him $100. Even as a kid, Dominic could sense it. His uncle wasn't just doing good. He was doing something. Then he turned 10, and things got loud. Frank Scalice was murdered, shot 4 times in broad daylight while buying peaches at a Bronx deli. The next day, the cops found a loan shark ledger in his apartment with names of 20 officials. They also found vacation photos, him and Lucky Luciano in Italy. It didn't end there. Soon after, Frank's brother, Joe Scalice, disappeared. The Gaggi family went to pay respects. Dominic remembered comforting a crying relative while Nino huddled in a corner with grave-looking men. A few weeks later, Albert Anastasia was gunned down in a Manhattan hotel barber chair. This wasn't just business. This was war. Frank Scalise's murder lit the fuse. His brother Joe disappeared not long after. Then the whispers started. Genovese wanted the crown, and he wasn't waiting around for permission. Names flew like bullets. Genovese, Anastasia, Gambino. Crews picked sides, bodies piled up. Gambino slipped into Vito's camp without saying a word. Anastasia, paranoid and increasingly reckless, started killing anyone he didn't trust. Even Tommy Eberly stepped back, reading the room. His brother Patsy flew to Sicily to meet Luciano. In Taormina, they sat on a boat in the Ionian Sea, just 2 wise guys floating in silence. Strategy disguised as small talk. Patsy was hedging, Luciano said later. Didn't want to sell out his brother. but he gave me the lay of the land. After Scalice got clipped, the streets were boiling. Luciano listened. Then she sent Patsy home. No instructions, just a look. The kid was already torn between me and his brother. I couldn't ask for more, but I had a bad feeling. Maybe Albert never got my message. If that was true, there was one reason. Gambino hadn't passed it on. And why would he? Luciano had played that game before, sitting silent while enemies tore each other apart. Gambino was doing the same. Smart, patient, deadly. One clean shot, and he'd be king. Back in 1951, Anastasia had murdered the Mangano brothers to take the throne. But now he was slipping, violent, predictable. And Gambino was done looking over his shoulder. Luciano tried to protect Albert. He didn't trust Genovese. Costello was finished. Adonis, deported. Lansky, too smart, too careful, and too Jewish for Vito's ambitions. That left Anastasia, flawed but loyal. Luciano still had hope. He sent Paul Gambino to Italy with one final request. Tell Anastasia to stop using the same routes. Change his habits, switch it up, lay low. Anastasia shrugged. Did what he wanted. That cost him. New York was spiraling. Territories blurred. The 5 families were locking down rackets as new gangs tried to muscle in. Unions were under fire. Congressional hearings started digging into corruption on the docks, into the Teamsters. Even after a journalist was blinded by acid, the spotlight kept growing. Everything was getting too public, too unstable. The commission needed quiet, stability, not a warlord with a target on his back. So Vito Genovese made a move. He went to Profaci, arranged the hit through the only men crazy enough to take it, the Gallo brothers. Profaci agreed. It solidified his own ties to Genovese. And just like that, the blueprint Luciano once used to take down Masseria and Maranzano was now being used against him. The only thing that stung was that it was Vito pulling the strings. Anyone else, maybe he could have stomached it. In October 1957, Albert Anastasia was gunned down in a hotel barber chair. 5 bullets. No mercy. To young Dominic, it felt like watching the mayor get killed. Nobody shielded him from the news. Maybe they wanted him to see it for what it was. The reports called Anastasia the boss of New York's most brutal criminal empire. His right-hand man, Frank Scalice. His brother, still missing. Carlo Gambino was the name on everyone's lips now. Rumored heir, sly like a fox, they said. Dominic added something of his own, and strong like a lion. Nino and his family bunkered down. Cards, cigarettes. Long silences. Outside, the city was shaking. Inside, the only crack came from Dominic's mother, whispering to her parents about that stupid life her brothers lived. Dominic didn't flinch. He knew this was a test. Of loyalty, of blood. He sang Little Darlin' to lighten the mood. Nobody laughed. Nobody talked about what was really happening. Not out loud. When Albert Anastasia was shot dead, Carlo Gambino was exactly where he needed to be. For more than a decade, he had watched, learned, and waited, positioned close to tough Tony Anastasia, absorbing everything, the way the man moved, the way he ruled. He had studied him like a general studies a battlefield, and now the battlefield was quiet. But what Gambino saw next shook him. It was at Frank Costello's apartment. Gambino walked in and froze. There they were, Frank and Tony Anastasia, 2 legends of the old world, men who had made their bones during Prohibition, fought beside killers, outlasted the toughest boots in America. Now they were in each other's arms, crying. Tough Tony, crying. Gambino said nothing. He didn't need to. The message was loud enough. It had all been an illusion. The myth of the untouchable gangster, the sadistic killer who ruled by fear, had collapsed the moment Albert dropped to the floor in a pool of blood. America had played along with the myth for decades. They needed to believe that gangsters only acted the way they did because monsters like Anastasia made them. But now, the monster was gone. And the men behind him were human, vulnerable. Frank Costello, the old fox, knew what came next. Within hours of the shooting, George Wolfe arrived at Frank's apartment. He found him in pieces, shoulders slumped, voice thin, still clinging to Tony Anastasia, like a dying brother. Frank looked up from the couch, his eyes rimmed red, and said it plain. "This means I'm next." George didn't answer. There was nothing to say. The shield was gone. As long as Anastasia was alive, no one dared move on Costello. Now, he was naked in the wind. Gambino saw it too. Not just death, but the collapse of structure, the rules, the order, the illusion. Gone. If men like Frank and Tony were breaking down, the streets would follow. The bloodshed would spiral. But where others saw chaos, Gambino saw opportunity. It was time for a new era. No more open war. No more public executions in barber chairs. Gambino had always preferred silence. Now he could shape the commission into something lasting. He needed stability, peace, a way to clean up the mess New York had become, and to make sense of what had happened. But to do that, he had to face Genovese. He would need to sit across from Veto and offer what no one else could. Order, an explanation, a blueprint for how to rebuild, not just for their sake, but for the whole country watching. The message was simple. Enough. Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese had the table set. Gambino knew what he had to do. He reached across the table, not literally, but with power. Word would go out to Vito Genovese, "Tell your guys to cool it." That meant Profaci too. Vito was going to bring Bonanno to heel also. New York was coming apart fast. Costello had taken a bullet to the head. The Mangano brothers was dead. Willie Moretti was dead. Frank Scalice and his brother Joe, and now Albert Anastasia, was bleeding out on the tile floor of a hotel barber shop. The city was on the edge of war. Inside Anastasia's old crew, a storm was brewing. These weren't button men from the street. Some of them were the last ghosts of Murder Inca. The kind of guys who didn't hesitate. And they were howling for blood, screaming for retribution. Not just for Anastasia, for honor. Agnello Della Croce's young wolves wanted vengeance. They didn't want diplomacy. They wanted war. One of those wolves was a kid from East New York with something to prove, John Gotti. But diplomacy won out, at least for now. Tough Tony reached out to Della Croce himself, told him to stand down. The family wasn't ready to go scorched earth. Not yet. Order first. Blood later. Meanwhile, the NYPD was under pressure. Commissioner Stephen P. Kennedy gave the order. Clean house. The Lower East Side was lit up like a war zone. 5 murders, all tied to organized crime, and Victor Riesel, the labor columnist, blinded by acid in broad daylight. The cops went for the jugular. A confidential squad swept the blocks near the Ravenite Social Club. First to go down, Agnello Della Croce, Ralph De Paola, and a longshoreman named Epifanio Orio. Della Croce, who hadn't clocked in for months, had over $2,000 in his pocket and a homemade blackjack in his car. They hit him with everything: vagrancy, weapons charges, consorting, anything to slow the machine. Back in court, Johnny Dio, the labor racketeer behind the Riesel hit, was locked in a max security cell. His brother, Tommy, sat in federal detention on $75,000 bail. Another player, Gandolfo Miranti, the suspected fingerman in the Riesel case, was quietly moved upstate. They feared he'd get hit before he could testify. Meanwhile, Charlie Whoppy Carlino started singing like a bird, hoping to dodge a life sentence. The pressure was on. And behind the scenes, Gambino and Genovese were playing chess while everyone else played checkers. One by one, Gambino's predecessors were eliminated. Albert Anastasia, the Mangano brothers, and later even Joe Adonis, who dropped dead in Italy under suspicious circumstances. The only one who'd make it out clean was Gambino himself. Natural causes. A rare thing in his world. Costello was losing grip. Legal heat was closing in. Tough Tony, seeing what was coming, pulled back. He wanted to stabilize the remnants of the Anastasia crew and keep his own people intact. Lucchese, Genovese, Profaci, and Bonanno, they made a move. A commission sit-down was ordered. The plan was simple. Crown Vito Genovese as boss of Luciano's old outfit and hand Anastasia's empire to Gambino. It was supposed to be an encore to the Costello retirement summit. The date was set. The location, the estate of Ricci the Boot Boiardo in New Jersey. No one showed. Why? Because Genovese had lied. He told them Luciano approved the plan. He hadn't. The bosses didn't like being played. Not by Vito. Not by Gambino. If this thing was going to work, it needed more than muscle. It needed old blood. Quiet power. A family older than even the New York Mafia itself. So, they turned to the old guard. The real old guard. Santo Volpe's empire, out of Pennsylvania. A network that stretched from the Prohibition days all the way back to the early Black Hand years. The men in charge now were the quiet architects of the next move. Joe Barbara, Russell Bufalino, Stefano Magadino. They had reached America, Canada, Mexico. They could touch every boss on the map. They picked the spot. Appalachian, New York. Remote, quiet, surrounded by woods. And in November 1957, just 3 weeks after Anastasia's assassination, the meeting was on. They came in from everywhere. I am from New York, Jersey, and Philly. I am from Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, from Cuba, from the Bahamas. Dozens of bosses. Not soldiers, bosses. But what was meant to be a coronation turned into a collapse. Someone tipped the cops. The meeting imploded. Cars screeched into the woods. Mobsters in silk suits running through cow pastures like cornered rats. The press had a field day. The FBI had names. And just like that, the underworld was exposed. Not because they weren't careful, but because too many people wanted too much power. What Gambino built survived. But everything changed after Appalachian. Everyone knew who it was now. And from that moment on, the mob wasn't a rumor or a whisper. It was on paper. It had faces, names, addresses. The shadows got a spotlight. But the game didn't end. It just got quieter, smarter, deadlier.